My name is Milton. I am 69 years old, and for the last decade I let my daughter and her husband believe they were the masters of a kingdom I built with my own bare hands. I received a terminal heart diagnosis on a freezing Tuesday. When I dropped my heart medication on their pristine hardwood floor and asked my son-in-law for a simple favor, he looked me dead in the eye, kicked the bottle across the room, and snapped that he was not my servant. My own daughter just sat there silently filing her nails. I did not yell. I just forced a smile and walked away into the snow. By the time the sun rose, I made one phone call, and by lunchtime they had absolutely nothing left. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to teach a harsh lesson to someone who mistook your silence for weakness. It was the coldest evening in Chicago when the doctor handed me the papers. A failing heart, severe coronary artery disease. He told me I needed absolute rest, zero stress, and strict adherence to my new medication schedule if I wanted to see my 70th birthday. I walked out of that hospital feeling the heavy weight of my mortality pressing down on my chest. I drove my beat-up 2005 Ford pickup back to the house. It was a massive $2 million modern estate in one of the most exclusive suburbs in the state. I parked in the sprawling driveway feeling every ache in my joints as I stepped out into the biting winter wind. My hands were shaking from the cold and the terrifying reality of the diagnosis. I walked through the grand double doors, shaking the snow off my old faded flannel shirt. The house was excessively warm, smelling of expensive catering and pure entitlement. Blake, my 35-year-old son-in-law, was lounging on the custom Italian leather sofa, sipping an aged bourbon from a crystal glass. My daughter Jada was sitting across from him, flipping through a glossy luxury magazine. I took off my heavy coat, my fingers stiff and clumsy from the freezing temperatures outside. As I reached into my pocket to pull out the prescription bottle the pharmacy had just filled, my grip failed. The plastic bottle slipped through my fingers and clattered loudly onto the polished mahogany floor, rolling directly toward Blake's expensive designer shoes. A sudden sharp pain flared in my chest, a terrifying reminder of the doctor's explicit warning. I leaned heavily against the marble foyer table, trying to catch my breath and steady my racing heart. "Blake," I said, my voice hoarse and weak. "Could you pick that up for me? My chest is incredibly tight. The doctor said I need to avoid bending over right now." Blake did not move immediately. He slowly lowered his crystal glass, swirling the amber liquid inside with a look of supreme annoyance. He looked down at the orange plastic bottle resting against the toe of his shoe, then looked up at me. His eyes were filled with that familiar underlying disdain he had harbored since the day Jada brought him home. He always saw me as the outdated blue-collar black man who simply did not fit into his polished corporate country club world. I was just an eyesore in the flawless, upper-class life he truly believed he had earned all by himself. Blake smirked, a cruel and arrogant twist of his lips that made my blood run cold. Instead of reaching down to help a sick old man, he casually swung his foot and kicked the bottle. It skidded harshly across the hardwood floor, spinning wildly until it hit the baseboards near the dark hallway. I stood there completely stunned by the sheer malice of the act. "Get it yourself, Milton." Blake snapped, his voice dripping with absolute venom. "I am not your servant. You have been loitering in our house, eating our food, and embarrassing us in front of our high-profile guests with your cheap clothes long enough. I am totally done catering to a sick old man. Jada, you need to get this old guy out of the house before he drags our reputation down completely." I slowly shifted my gaze to my daughter, my own flesh and blood. The little girl I had carried on my shoulders, the child I had worked grueling double shifts to put through expensive Ivy League schools so she would never have to struggle. I waited for her to speak up. I waited for her to defend her father. Jada did not even flinch. She did not defend me. She did not reprimand her husband for his blatant, disgusting disrespect. She simply turned the page of her magazine, pulled out a glass emery board, and began casually filing her manicured nails. The utter silence from her was deafening. It was louder and far more painful than Blake's shouting. It was a complete and absolute betrayal. The air in the grand living room grew incredibly heavy. They thought I was just going to lower my head, apologize for being a burden, and shuffle away like a beaten dog. They genuinely thought they held all the power in this dynamic. They thought I was a fragile, penniless dependent clinging to their generous charity. They had absolutely no idea who they were dealing with. I did not yell. I did not shed a single tear. A profound icy calm washed over my entire body. It was the exact same cold, calculated focus I used to survive the grueling, unforgiving streets of South Chicago 40 years ago. Back then, I was a young, ambitious contractor breathing in toxic concrete dust every single day. I broke my back carrying heavy steel beams, and I fought tooth and nail against corrupt city officials and ruthless competitors to build my business from the ground up. I started with nothing but a rusty hammer and a fierce will to provide for my late wife, Diane. Diane always warned me about Jada's growing entitlement when she was a teenager. My beautiful wife told me not to spoil our daughter, warning me that giving a child everything on a silver platter would leave them with zero respect for the struggle and no moral compass. I should have listened to her. Over the decades, I built a massive underground real estate empire. I hid my tens of millions of dollars behind multiple layers of blind trusts and corporate holding companies to protect my assets. I bought this very $2 million estate with my own hard-earned cash. I put the deed in Jada's name purely as a tax strategy and a measure of ultimate trust, assuming my daughter would always honor and protect her father. Because of my old flannel shirts, my beat-up truck, and my stubborn refusal to flaunt my wealth, Blake assumed I was broke. He assumed he was the absolute king of the castle. He loved to parade around the neighborhood, boasting to his equally arrogant friends about his massive property, completely oblivious to the fact that he was standing squarely on the foundation of a black man's lifelong labor. Looking at them now, wallowing in their arrogant delusion, I felt the very last shred of my parental leniency evaporate into thin air. They looked at me and saw a weak old man with a failing heart. They did not see the apex predator who had devoured far smarter and far more ruthless men in the commercial contracting world. They had completely forgotten the iron will required to build a dynasty from dirt. I realized right then and there that kindness without strict boundaries only breeds monsters. My unconditional love had turned my only daughter into a parasite, and she had married a leech. I took a slow, deep breath, regulating my heart rate exactly as the cardiologist had advised. I forced a small, chilling smile onto my face. It was the smile of a man who held an unbeatable winning hand and was about to flip the entire table over. I slowly walked over to the baseboards, bent down carefully despite the pain in my chest, and picked up my medication. I did not say a single word to Blake. I did not cast a single glance toward Jada. I walked straight to the hall closet and pulled out a small, worn canvas duffel bag I always kept packed for emergencies. I grabbed my heavy winter coat and pushed the grand front door open, stepping out into the brutal, snowy Chicago night. The freezing air hit my face, but I felt completely alive and fiercely awake. I pulled out my cell phone and dialed a number I knew by heart. Richard picked up on the second ring. He was my brilliant financial lawyer, the ruthless architect of my corporate structure, and the only man alive who knew the true, terrifying extent of my wealth and power. Richard I said, my voice steady and completely devoid of emotion against the howling wind. "It is time. Activate Protocol Alpha. Cut off absolutely everything." The sun rose over Chicago, casting a harsh, blinding glare across the snow-covered lawns of the exclusive gated community. At precisely 7:30 in the morning, Blake stepped out of the massive front doors of the estate, adjusting his custom-tailored Italian wool coat. He was holding a leather briefcase in one hand and the keys to his prized possession in the other, a brand-new, fully loaded Porsche Cayenne. To Blake, that car was the ultimate symbol of his fabricated success. It was his daily chariot, the perfect prop to convince his wealthy neighbors and arrogant corporate co-workers that he was a brilliant, self-made titan of industry. But as he strutted down the heated driveway, his smug smile vanished completely, replaced by an expression of pure, unadulterated panic. A massive, heavy-duty tow truck was backed directly into the driveway. A burly driver in a high-visibility jacket was securing thick steel chains to the front axle of the pristine Porsche. Blake dropped his expensive briefcase directly into the icy slush. He sprinted down the driveway, waving his arms frantically, his face turning a blotchy, furious shade of red. "What the hell do you think you are doing?" Blake screamed, his voice cracking with hysteria. "Get your filthy hands off my car right now. That is a $120,000 vehicle. I will sue you and your company into the ground. Drop the vehicle." The tow truck driver did not even flinch. He casually chewed his gum, tightened the heavy steel winch, and pulled a worn clipboard from his jacket pocket. "I am just doing my job, buddy," the driver replied with absolute icy indifference. "I have a legal repossession order. Step back before you get hurt." "Repossession!" Blake shrieked, his voice echoing loudly off the neighboring mansions. Several affluent neighbors, drawn by the loud commotion, began peeking through their expensive custom blinds to watch the show. "You are out of your mind. I am a senior vice president. I do not get my luxury cars repossessed. This is grand theft auto." Blake pulled out his phone with trembling hands and immediately dialed 911. He screamed at the dispatcher, claiming an armed thug was stealing his luxury vehicle right out of his driveway. Within 5 minutes, the flashing blue and red lights of a local police cruiser cut through the falling snow. Two stern-looking officers stepped out, hands resting cautiously on their duty belts. Blake immediately ran up to them, pointing an accusatory finger at the calm tow truck driver. "Arrest him right now," Blake demanded, his entitlement in full embarrassing display. "He is trying to steal my Porsche. I want him in handcuffs." The older officer held up a hand, silencing Blake's tantrum instantly. "Sir, calm down and step back immediately." "Let me see the paperwork," he said, turning to the tow truck driver. The driver casually handed over the clipboard. The officer reviewed the legal documents, walked over to the Porsche, and checked the vehicle identification number against the paperwork. He then radioed dispatch to verify the license plates. A tense, agonizing minute passed. Blake stood there, breathing heavily, adjusting his expensive tie, completely confident that the police would bow to his perceived authority and throw the working-class driver in jail. Instead, the older officer walked back over, handed the clipboard back to the driver, and looked at Blake with a distinct smirk of amusement. "Sir, this car does not belong to you," the officer stated loudly, ensuring the nosy neighbors could hear every single word. Blake scoffed, a look of pure outrage crossing his face. "What are you talking about? I drive that car every single day." The officer shook his head. "You might drive it, but you definitely do not own it. According to the state registry and this verified repossession order, this vehicle is leased under a commercial entity named Apex Holdings. The corporate office formally terminated the lease agreement at exactly 2 o'clock this morning. They dispatched this recovery team to retrieve their corporate property. This is a lawful civil matter. If you interfere again, I will arrest you for obstructing a legal repossession." Blake stood frozen in the snow, his jaw practically hitting the frozen pavement. The tow truck engine roared to life and the heavy chains pulled the gleaming Porsche up onto the flatbed. Blake watched helplessly as his ultimate status symbol was hauled away into the morning traffic. Jada ran out of the front door, pulling her silk robe tightly around her, her face pale with shock. "Blake, what is going on? Where is your car?" she yelled over the freezing wind. Blake turned to her, his face twisted in a mixture of profound humiliation and blind rage. "It is that miserable, broke old man," he spat out, kicking a pile of dirty snow. "Your father brings nothing but absolute bad luck. Ever since he dropped his stupid pills last night and walked out, everything is going wrong. He is a pathetic, outdated loser, and the universe is punishing us for letting his miserable energy into our home." Sitting in the plush leather chair of my secure penthouse office downtown, I watched the entire pathetic scene unfold live on my tablet. I had secretly installed high-definition audio and video security cameras around the perimeter of the estate months ago for security purposes. I took a slow sip of my black coffee, savoring the bitter taste. Blake was completely oblivious to the fact that the broke, outdated black man he was currently cursing was the sole owner and chief executive officer of Apex Holdings. He had absolutely no idea that the massive corporate entity that had just stripped him of his pride was the empire I built from a single rusted concrete mixer back in the 1980s. I spent 40 years inhaling toxic drywall dust, negotiating with ruthless union bosses, and fighting systemic discrimination in Chicago's commercial real estate market to build an absolute fortress of wealth. I created Apex Holdings to protect my family and build generational power. I authorized the corporate lease for that Porsche purely because Jada begged me to help her husband keep up appearances at his prestigious firm. Blake genuinely believed he was a self-made corporate king driving a luxury car I bought, paying for premium gas with money I generated through decades of literal blood, sweat, and tears. I let him play his little game of pretend because I loved my daughter and wanted her to be happy. But the moment he told me to pick up my own life-saving medication off his floor and treated me like a stray dog, the game was permanently over. He wanted to act like a self-sufficient king. Now I was going to let him experience exactly what it felt like to be a peasant. I watched through the camera feed as Blake frantically checked his heavy gold watch. He was already 30 minutes late for a critical morning strategy meeting at his firm. He pulled out his phone, his fingers shaking violently from the freezing cold and the lingering adrenaline, and aggressively ordered a premium black car service. "I cannot deal with this nonsense right now," he snapped at Jada, completely ignoring her confused, panicked questions. "I have a major board meeting. I will fix this ridiculous mess later. Go back inside." 10 minutes later, a sleek black sport utility vehicle pulled up to the curb. Blake climbed into the back seat, furiously brushing the snow off his custom suit, desperate to reclaim his shattered dignity. The ride to his towering glass office building in the financial district was incredibly tense. When the driver finally pulled up to the grand entrance, the fare displayed on the tablet was $95. Blake confidently pulled out his heavy metal black credit card. It was the prestigious card he loved to slam down on expensive restaurant tables to impress his arrogant colleagues. What he did not know, or simply chose to ignore in his supreme vanity, was that the card was merely an authorized user account linked directly to my primary private wealth line. He handed it to the driver with a highly dismissive flick of his wrist. The driver swiped the heavy metal card through the payment terminal. A sharp negative beep echoed in the quiet cabin. The driver frowned and tried again. Another sharp beep. "I am sorry, sir," the driver said, turning around with an unimpressed, tired look. "Your card is declining." Blake scoffed loudly, his face flushing red once again. "That is impossible. That is a premium corporate card with an unlimited balance. Run it again. Your machine must be broken or you do not know how to use it." The driver sighed heavily, clearly annoyed by the blatant disrespect. He inserted the chip directly into the reader and turned the screen around so Blake could see the glaring red letters for himself. "The machine is working perfectly fine, sir," the driver said, his voice completely devoid of any sympathy. "The screen says transaction denied, card permanently locked." At precisely 1 o'clock that afternoon, I sat in the sprawling corner office of my downtown headquarters, watching a series of automated alerts flash across my secure dual monitors. Protocol Alpha was executing flawlessly, cutting through their financial lifelines like a hot knife through butter. Every joint bank account, every authorized user credit card, and every single financial pipeline I had generously connected to Jada and Blake was systematically shut down. I watched a specific notification pop up in real time on the banking terminal. It was a charge attempt for $840 at Le Petit Palais, one of the most pretentious and ridiculously expensive French restaurants in the Gold Coast neighborhood. Jada was having her usual Friday lunch with her circle of high society country club wives. I could picture the scene perfectly. She would be sitting there in her designer silk blouse, sipping imported vintage champagne, laughing at shallow jokes, and desperately pretending she was born into old money. She loved to play the role of the self-made elite, conveniently ignoring the fact that her entire reality was subsidized by my holding company. When the waiter brought the leather-bound check presenter to the table, Jada would have confidently pulled out her platinum credit card, the one I paid off in full every single month without question. I watched the screen as the first transaction registered as declined. 2 minutes later, a second attempt appeared, this time using her emergency gold card. Declined. Another minute passed. A third attempt flashed on my monitor using a secondary corporate expense account she was never supposed to use for personal dining. Terminated. I leaned back in my heavy leather chair, steepling my fingers. The sheer panic settling into her stomach right at that exact moment must have been incredibly heavy. The whispers from her wealthy friends. The polite but firm tone of the French waiter asking for an alternative form of payment. The suffocating weight of sudden, inexplicable poverty crashing down on her flawless afternoon. Less than 5 minutes after the third card was rejected, my private cell phone began to vibrate on the heavy oak desk. The caller ID flashed my daughter's name. I let it ring 3 times before calmly pressing the answer button and bringing the phone to my ear. I did not say hello. I simply listened to the frantic, echoing acoustics of a public restroom. Jada had clearly retreated to the marble bathrooms to hide her absolute humiliation from her snobby friends. "Dad, what the hell is wrong with your bank accounts?" she hissed into the receiver, her voice vibrating with a mixture of profound embarrassment and unfiltered rage. "I am sitting at a table with the wives of 2 corporate executives and the mayor's niece. The waiter just told me in front of everyone that all 3 of my cards are declining. You need to call your wealth manager right now and fix this ridiculous glitch. It is incredibly embarrassing." She did not ask how I was feeling. She did not ask where I slept last night after I walked out into a freezing blizzard with a terminal heart diagnosis. She did not apologize for her husband kicking my life-saving medication across the hardwood floor while she sat there filing her nails. Her only concern in the entire world was her fabricated social standing and the $800 bill for truffles and champagne that she could not cover. The absolute sheer audacity of her entitlement was staggering, but it completely validated every single decision I had made since the previous night. I am stranded in the bathroom. Jada continued to rant, her breathing ragged and panicked. I cannot walk back out there. Call the bank, clear the security hold, and authorize the $800 immediately. Do not make me wait, Dad. Fix it right now before my friends start asking questions I cannot answer. I looked down at my hands resting on the polished mahogany desk. They were large, heavily calloused, and permanently scarred from 4 decades of brutal, unforgiving manual labor. I remembered the blistering summers of 1982 hauling cement blocks up 3 flights of stairs just so I could afford to buy Jada her first pair of pristine white ballet shoes. I remembered the freezing winters when the construction industry slowed down and her mother Diane scrubbed the floors of wealthy white families in the northern suburbs just to make sure our daughter could attend private school and never feel inferior to anyone. We broke our bodies to build her a throne, and she used it to look down on us. I remembered walking into bank branches in the late 80s being denied commercial loans simply because of the color of my skin, and having to work 10 times harder than the white developers just to secure a single contract. I took a slow, measured breath, letting the icy resolve of my past dictate my words. I thought the elegant wife of a senior vice president could easily afford her own lunch, I said, my voice dangerously low and completely devoid of any paternal warmth. I thought the daughter of a poor, lowly, outdated black construction worker should not be swiping premium credit cards funded entirely by his blue-collar blood and sweat. Jada fell completely silent on the other end of the line. The absolute shock of hearing me speak to her with such clinical detachment paralyzed her. You chose a man who thinks it is acceptable to treat a dying black man like a stray dog. I continued my words, striking like surgical blades. You sat there in the house that I bought on the furniture that I paid for, and you filed your nails while your husband kicked my heart medication across the floor. You chose his world over my blood. So let his world pay your bills. Call your arrogant husband to cover your expensive champagne, Jada, because from this second forward, my charity is permanently closed. I hung up the phone and placed it face down on the desk. Trapped in the restaurant bathroom, Jada had no choice but to call Blake. I watched the security feed from their estate later that evening, piecing together the spectacular failure of their afternoon. Blake had abandoned his disastrous day at the office to rush to the restaurant, eager to play the wealthy hero in front of Jada's elite circle. He stormed into the dining room, threw his own premium metal cards onto the silver tray, and offered the waiter a smug, condescending smile. But the waiter simply returned moments later, shaking his head. Every single one of Blake's cards was hard-locked. The public humiliation was absolute. The restaurant manager had to escort them to the back office to sign a promissory note, while Jada's friends hastily paid the bill and left in awkward, judgmental disgust. Now, listening to the hidden audio feeds in their living room, I heard Blake pacing like a rabid-cornered animal. "We are not letting that senile old man take our lifestyle away," Blake snarled, slamming his fist onto the marble counter. His brain is clearly deprived of oxygen from his heart condition. "Tomorrow morning I am hiring a lawyer. We are taking him to court, declaring him legally incompetent, and I am taking full control of his entire estate." The very next morning, the fragile wooden door of my newly rented apartment rattled violently under the force of aggressive, heavy knocking. I had intentionally leased this extremely small rundown unit on the south side of the city to perfectly maintain the illusion of my sudden poverty. Before I could even reach out to turn the deadbolt, the door was shoved open with immense force. Blake stormed into the tiny living room, bringing the bitter chill of the winter hallway with him. Jada followed closely behind, refusing to make eye contact with me, her arms crossed tightly over her expensive cashmere coat. Trailing them was a slick, nervous-looking man in a cheap, ill-fitting gray suit holding a worn leather briefcase. He did not look like a high-powered corporate attorney. He looked exactly like the kind of desperate, bottom-feeding lawyer who chased ambulances and forged signatures for a few $100s. I remained completely calm, sitting quietly in a faded armchair near the small, drafty window. I slowly poured myself a cup of hot black tea, letting the steam rise between us. Blake surveyed the peeling wallpaper and the badly stained linoleum floor with a look of absolute disgust. He genuinely believed he had successfully cornered a broke, dying old man who had nothing left but a failing heart and a meager pension. He thought this cheap apartment was the true extent of my reality after walking out of his supposed mansion. "You really have hit rock bottom, Milton," Blake sneered, stepping aggressively into my personal space. "This place is a complete dump. It is exactly where you belong, but we are not going to let your rapid mental decline ruin our financial stability." Blake snapped his fingers and the nervous lawyer immediately scurried forward, slapping a thick stack of legal documents onto my small, unstable coffee table. The title printed at the top was glaringly obvious. It was a comprehensive, durable power of attorney and a petition for full legal guardianship. Blake leaned over the table, planting his hands firmly on the wood, attempting to physically intimidate me with his presence. "We spoke to a medical professional this morning." Blake lied smoothly, his voice laced with venomous confidence. "He assured us that your severe coronary artery disease is severely restricting the blood flow to your brain. It is causing severe cognitive impairment, lack of rational judgment, and aggressive paranoia. That completely explains your erratic psychotic behavior yesterday. Cutting off our bank accounts, abandoning your only family, and moving into this pathetic slum are clear signs of a mind that is completely breaking down." Jada finally looked up, her face a mask of fake, meticulously rehearsed sympathy. "Dad, you are clearly not well," she said softly, though her eyes were completely dead and entirely focused on the paperwork. "You need help managing your daily life and your tiny pension. We just want to step in and take over the administrative burden. We need you to sign over the legal rights to your assets, your bank accounts, and specifically the deed to the estate so we can properly manage your care." They wanted it all. They wanted to strip me of my fundamental human rights, declare me legally insane, and chain me to their financial greed. They assumed I was terrified of the legal system, assuming that an elderly black man would simply sign the papers rather than fight a wealthy white executive in a courtroom. I slowly picked up my teacup, took a measured sip, and set it down precisely on the coaster. I looked directly at the shady lawyer who was actively sweating under my steady gaze, and then I looked deep into Blake's arrogant eyes. "Did you really think bringing a $2 strip mall lawyer to my apartment would make me tremble?" I asked, my voice incredibly calm, but carrying the crushing weight of absolute authority. I spent the entire decade of the 1980s managing crews of 500 hardened, ruthless construction workers. I negotiated with corrupt union bosses, fought off extortion attempts from organized crime syndicates, and built towering skyscrapers while standing on narrow steel beams 50 stories above the freezing concrete. I survived the most brutal, unforgiving era of commercial development in this city as a black man with absolutely zero inherited wealth and zero powerful friends. I did not survive decades of systemic abuse and cutthroat corporate warfare just to be intimidated by a mediocre middle management paper pusher and a spoiled daughter who cries in a bathroom over a declined credit card. I picked up the thick stack of guardianship papers. The lawyer took a sudden nervous step back. Blake puffed out his chest desperately, trying to maintain his dominant posture, but the sheer, unwavering intensity in my eyes made him hesitate. "You want to control my assets because you are completely bankrupt without my charity," I stated clearly, letting the harsh truth fill the tiny room. "You built a house of cards on my foundation, and now that I have pulled out the bottom, you are desperate to steal the deck." I gripped the legal documents tightly in my heavily calloused hands. With one swift, deliberate motion, I tore the entire stack of thick papers in half. I placed the torn pieces perfectly on top of each other and tore them again, letting the shredded remnants fall like snow onto the stained linoleum floor. "I am not signing anything." Blake's face contorted into an ugly mask of pure, unrestrained fury. He pointed a shaking finger directly at my face. "You are making a massive mistake, you arrogant old fool," Blake shouted, completely dropping his fake medical concern. "If you will not cooperate voluntarily, we will drag you into family court. We will mandate a forced psychiatric evaluation, and a judge will strip you of your rights entirely. We will lock you in a state-run facility and take the house anyway. Enjoy your pathetic little slum while you still can." Blake turned on his heel and stormed out of the apartment, shoving the door open with massive force. The shady lawyer scrambled out immediately behind him, eager to escape the tension. Jada lingered for just a fraction of a second, her eyes darting greedily to the torn legal papers on the floor before she silently followed her husband into the hallway, slamming the door shut behind her. The small apartment fell perfectly silent once again. I did not feel any fear. I did not feel threatened by his loud legal ultimatums or his promises of forced medical evaluations. I simply smiled, a cold, highly calculating smile. I reached up and gently tapped the top button of my worn flannel shirt. It was not a normal button. It was a high-definition micro-hidden camera that my private investigator had provided to me the night before. I had just successfully recorded every single threat, every single medical lie, and every piece of their illegal extortion attempt in perfect, undeniable audio and video. 2 days later, a thick manila envelope was aggressively shoved under the door of my small apartment. I picked it up feeling the heavy official weight of the legal documents inside. It was a formal summons from the family court of Cook County. Attached to the summons was a detailed, highly clinical psychiatric evaluation declaring me entirely unfit to manage my own affairs. The evaluation was signed by a Dr. Julian Vance, a supposedly reputable neurologist operating out of a high-end private clinic downtown. According to the document, I was suffering from advanced vascular dementia, experiencing severe paranoid delusions, and required immediate transfer to an assisted living facility. I read the detailed descriptions of my supposed mental decline with a cold, absolute clarity. Blake had actually done it. He had found a doctor willing to completely fabricate a terminal mental health diagnosis for a healthy man without ever laying eyes on him. The sheer terrifying reality of a corrupt medical professional willing to strip away my human rights for a paycheck would have terrified an ordinary elderly man. But I was not ordinary, and I was certainly not alone. I immediately picked up my phone and dialed Leon. Leon was a former Marine recon sniper turned private investigator who handled all the sensitive corporate espionage for my real estate empire. I gave him the doctor's name. Within 3 hours, Leon was sitting across from me at my small kitchen table, dropping a completely different, far more devastating file onto the stained linoleum. Dr. Julian Vance was not a respected medical professional. He was a desperate, compromised addict drowning in an ocean of illegal gambling debt. Leon laid out the glossy high-definition photographs and financial tracking logs on my table. Dr. Vance owed over $400,000 to an illegal sports betting syndicate operating out of the West Side. He was 3 months behind on his extortionate interest payments, and the loan sharks were actively threatening to break his hands, effectively ending his lucrative surgical career. Blake must have discovered this crippling vulnerability through his shady legal contacts and offered the desperate doctor a quick, untraceable cash bribe to falsify my medical records. The arrogance of my son-in-law was genuinely staggering. He truly believed he could manipulate the medical and legal systems to steal my house and my pension without any resistance. I put on my heavy winter coat and drove my beat-up Ford truck directly to the luxurious downtown clinic. I did not bother checking in at the pristine marble reception desk. I walked straight past the protesting nurses, my heavy boots thudding against the polished floor, and pushed open the solid oak door to Dr. Vance's private office. He was sitting behind a massive glass desk, looking completely exhausted and deeply anxious. He stood up, outraged, demanding to know who I was and threatening to call security. I did not raise my voice. I simply reached into my coat, pulled out Leon's thick file, and dropped the glossy photographs of his illegal bookmakers directly onto his pristine glass desk. I watched the arrogant, wealthy doctor look down at the images of the dangerous men holding his debt. All the blood instantly drained from his face, leaving him pale and completely terrified. He fell back into his expensive ergonomic chair, staring at me as if I were the Grim Reaper himself. "I am Milton, the man you just declared legally insane without ever taking my blood pressure," I said, my voice cutting through the quiet office like a frozen blade. "And I just bought your entire gambling debt from the West Side Syndicate." Dr. Vance began to stammer, his hands shaking violently as he tried to push the photographs away. He frantically tried to explain that it was a massive misunderstanding, that he was under immense financial pressure, and that Blake had practically forced him into signing the fabricated evaluation. I slammed my heavy, calloused hand down onto the glass desk, the sound cracking like a gunshot in the sterile room. I did not spend the late 80s fighting off real organized extortion rackets in the Chicago construction industry just to be swindled by a weak pill pushing degenerate in a white coat. I stated, my eyes locked dead onto his terrified face. Back when I was building the foundations of this city, corrupt city inspectors and union mobsters tried to crush my business every single day. I ruined them. I buried their careers, and I took their territories. I survived the most cutthroat commercial real estate wars in this state because I never ever leave an enemy breathing. You sold my mental competency to a mediocre corporate middle manager for a few $1,000s. Now I own your debt, I own your medical license, and I own your absolute obedience. If you do not do exactly what I tell you, I will hand these files over to the medical board tomorrow morning and I will let the syndicate break every single finger on both of your hands." The doctor was sweating profusely, nodding his head in rapid, desperate submission. He begged me to tell him what I wanted, promising to retract the evaluation and apologize to the court. I told him he was not going to retract anything. He was going to become my personal inside asset. He was going to feed Blake's arrogance while delivering him directly into a trap so tightly woven he would never escape. I instructed the doctor to pick up his phone right then and call my son-in-law. I stood silently over his shoulder as he dialed the number, his hands still trembling. Blake answered on the first ring, his voice dripping with smug, unwarranted confidence. Dr. Vance cleared his throat, reading exactly from the script I had just written down for him on his own prescription pad. "Blake, we have a massive problem." The doctor lied flawlessly, his voice sounding genuinely panicked. "The old man is not broke. He has a hidden safe deposit box with millions of dollars in untraceable assets, but he is having moments of extreme clarity. He is threatening to hire a major law firm to contest the guardianship." I heard Blake curse loudly through the phone speaker. Then my son-in-law crossed a line from which there was absolutely no return. "Do not let him get a lawyer," Blake hissed, his voice cold and completely devoid of humanity. "Prescribe him a highly aggressive specialized sedative. Give Jada something that will completely scramble his brain and make him truly lose his mind. I will have my wife slip it to him tonight." It was barely past twilight when a heavy knock echoed through the thin door of my cramped apartment. I checked the hidden camera feed on my phone before moving. It was Jada. She was holding a large, insulated container, her face perfectly arranged into a mask of deep, agonizing remorse. Her designer coat looked entirely out of place in this rundown hallway. I unlocked the deadbolt and pulled the door open. She immediately burst into fake dramatic tears, rushing forward to throw her arms around me. "Dad, I am so incredibly sorry," she sobbed, burying her face into my old flannel shirt. "Blake was completely out of line. I was just so scared and overwhelmed by your diagnosis that I froze. Please forgive me." I let her hold me, my arms hanging limply by my sides. I could smell the expensive perfume she bought with my money, masking the absolute rot of her intentions. I stepped back and invited her in, playing the role of the tired, forgiving father eager to reconnect with his only child. She ushered me to the faded armchair in the corner, fussing over me like a highly dedicated nurse. She unpacked a container of hot chicken soup and insisted I needed to rest my failing heart. "Let me get you some water, Dad," she offered, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness. "You need to stay hydrated and rest your mind." She walked over to the small kitchenette. My apartment was tiny, and the kitchen sink was positioned directly opposite a large, uncurtained window that looked out into the dark, snowy alley. The black glass against the night acted as a perfect, flawless mirror. I kept my head facing forward, but I shifted my eyes, watching her reflection closely. Jada checked over her shoulder to make sure I was not looking, then quickly reached into her designer handbag. She pulled out a small plastic vial, crushed a heavy white pill into her palm, and dropped the powder directly into the glass of tap water. She stirred it rapidly with a metal spoon until the liquid was completely clear again. My own daughter. The child I had taught to ride a bike on the cracked pavement of South Side Chicago. The girl I had carried on my shoulders during summer parades. She was intentionally poisoning me just to steal my life's work. As she walked back toward me with the spiked glass in her hand, my mind flashed back 30 years to a bitter argument I had with my late wife, Diane. Jada was just a teenager back then, demanding a brand new luxury vehicle for her 16th birthday after recklessly crashing the used car I had already bought her. I was ready to write the check because I never wanted my little girl to feel the stinging humiliation of poverty that I grew up with. Diane slammed her hand down on our kitchen table, her eyes fierce and uncompromising. "Milton, you cannot buy character," she warned me, her voice echoing in my memory right now. "If you give that girl everything she demands without making her earn a single dime, you will strip away her dignity. You are not protecting her. You are creating an entitled predator. One day she will absolutely bite the very hand that feeds her." I brushed Diane off back then, thoroughly convinced my immense wealth could shield my family from the world's ugly realities. I thought providing financial security was the ultimate form of fatherly love. Looking at Jada now smiling warmly as she handed me a glass laced with a mind-destroying sedative, I realized my beautiful wife had been entirely right. My blind generosity had forged the exact weapon they were using to destroy me. Jada had completely bypassed basic human empathy and gone straight for absolute greed. She was willing to scramble her own father's brain just to maintain a lifestyle she never actually earned. I reached out and took the glass from her trembling hand. "Thank you, sweetheart," I said, making sure my voice sounded intentionally weak and wavering. "I am just so incredibly tired today." I brought the rim to my lips, feigning a long, deep gulp, but I kept my mouth tightly closed. I let the cold water spill down my chin and soak directly into the thick collar of my shirt. Jada did not even notice the spill. She was too intensely focused on the expected outcome, watching me like a hawk stalking injured prey. I set the half-empty glass on the coffee table and leaned back heavily into the armchair. I let a minute pass in absolute silence. Then I let my eyelids flutter shut. I let my breathing slow down, purposely mimicking the deep, unnatural sleep of someone who had been heavily sedated. I let my jaw go slack and went completely limp against the cushions. The moment my chin hit my chest, the entire atmosphere in the room shifted. I heard Jada let out a sharp, impatient sigh. The fake tears evaporated instantly. Her sweet, concerned expression vanished, replaced by the cold, calculating greed of a common thief. She did not check my pulse. She did not ask if I was comfortable. She simply stepped right over my legs and began systematically tearing the small apartment apart. I listened to the sound of my daughter violating my privacy. She rummaged through my coat pockets, aggressively flipped through the stacks of mail on the kitchen counter, and tore open the drawers of my cheap wooden desk. She was frantically searching for the key. Dr. Vance had mentioned the key to the hidden fortune she believed would solve all of Blake's problems. I watched her through barely slitted eyes as she found exactly what I wanted her to find. Resting deliberately under a stack of old utility bills inside the bottom desk drawer was a heavy brass safe deposit box key. It was attached to a prominent tag from a major downtown banking institution. Jada gasped quietly, a sharp intake of breath signaling her absolute triumph. She snatched the key eagerly, her eyes lighting up with unadulterated greed. She shoved the heavy brass key deep into her expensive coat pocket, grabbed her handbag, and walked right out the front door without a single backward glance. She left her father slumped in a chair, completely convinced she had just successfully drugged me and secured the keys to my hidden empire. The door clicked shut, and I opened my eyes, a cold, predatory smile spreading across my face. The trap was officially set. The next morning, the financial district of downtown Chicago was a frozen canyon of towering glass and steel. I sat comfortably in the heated back of Leon's unmarked surveillance van, parked discreetly across the street from the massive stone columns of the First Chicago Trust. Leon handed me a pair of high-powered binoculars and tapped the glowing screen of his encrypted laptop. We had full, unrestricted access to the bank's lobby cameras, courtesy of a personal favor the regional security director owed me from a highly lucrative commercial construction contract I awarded him decades ago. Through the heavy revolving glass doors, I watched Jada and Blake stride into the grand lobby. They looked exactly like two starving vultures who had just spotted a fresh, undefended carcass. Blake was wearing his absolute best-tailored power suit, strutting with that unearned, arrogant confidence I absolutely despised. Jada was clutching her designer handbag tightly against her side, practically vibrating with greedy, desperate anticipation. They genuinely believed they were walking into that bank vault to inherit a hidden, untraceable fortune. They thought the heavy brass key Jada had stolen from my apartment desk was their golden ticket back to the luxury lifestyle they felt so deeply entitled to. I watched closely as Blake confidently approached the head teller, aggressively flashing a forged power of attorney document that his cheap strip mall lawyer had undoubtedly drafted the night before. The teller, who had been fully briefed by the branch manager on my exact strict instructions, politely nodded without questioning the forgery. The teller turned and escorted them down the winding marble staircase toward the secure underground vault. They were walking straight into the jaws of an inescapable trap, entirely convinced of their own brilliant superiority. I leaned back in the dark van, taking a slow, satisfying sip from a thermos of strong black coffee. They were expecting to find stacks of crisp $100 bills, bearer bonds, or the deeds to my hidden real estate empire. They were expecting immediate financial salvation. Down in the vault, the attendant unlocked the heavy steel door of box 247. He slid the long metal container out with a metallic scrape and placed it precisely on the center table in a private soundproof viewing room. He then stepped out and closed the door, leaving Blake and Jada completely alone in the quiet security of the vault. Leon switched the laptop feed to the hidden micro camera I had specifically requested the bank manager place inside that viewing room. The audio feed was crystal clear. "We hit the absolute jackpot," Blake whispered, rubbing his hands together like a greedy child. "Open it up, Jada. Let us see how much cash the miserable old man was hiding from us all these years." Jada eagerly flipped the twin brass latches and threw open the lid. The expression on her meticulously contoured face shifted instantly from triumphant joy to utter paralyzing confusion. There was no cash. There were no gold bars. There were no property deeds. Inside the long metal box was absolutely nothing but a single thick manila folder. Blake frowned heavily, aggressively snatching the folder from the box. "What is this garbage?" he muttered, tearing the envelope open with impatient hands. He expected financial blueprints to an empire. Instead, he pulled out a thick stack of highly detailed, extremely incriminating legal and financial loan documents. I watched through the digital screen as all the blood violently drained from Blake's face. His immense arrogance shattered in real time, replaced by a look of profound, suffocating terror. He dropped the heavy stack of papers onto the table as if they were physically burning his hands. Jada reached over and snatched them up, her eyes scanning the bold, aggressive print at the top of the pages. Her initial confusion rapidly morphed into pure, unadulterated horror. "These are loan documents," Jada said, her voice trembling uncontrollably. "Blake, this contract says you borrowed $300,000 from a private equity group on the South Side. What is this? Why does it have my signature on the primary guarantor line?" Blake was hyperventilating, backing away from the table, completely unable to form a coherent sentence. He looked like a man who had just stepped off a ledge into a bottomless pit. The documents resting in that metal box were not just standard everyday bank loans. They were explicit, highly predatory debt contracts from one of the most ruthless underground lending syndicates in the city of Chicago. Months ago, my elite team of forensic accountants uncovered a massive financial hemorrhage in Blake's accounts. I learned that he had developed a massive, crippling addiction to high-stakes, unregulated cryptocurrency trading. He genuinely thought he was a financial genius, constantly chasing the next digital gold rush to prove he was fundamentally better than the wealthy corporate executives he desperately tried to emulate. When the volatile market inevitably crashed and wiped out his entire leveraged portfolio, he panicked. Instead of admitting his monumental failure and taking the financial loss like a grown man, he went to the criminal underworld to borrow massive amounts of illicit capital to double down on his bad bets. But the loan sharks would never lend that kind of hard cash to a middle management paper pusher with a heavily mortgaged, highly leveraged lifestyle. They demanded solid collateral. So Blake did exactly what cowards always do when backed into a corner. He forged my daughter's signature. He used her name and the widely assumed implied backing of my vast wealth to secretly guarantee the $300,000 loan. He threw his own wife directly into the line of fire just to save his fragile, pathetic ego. Back in the 1980s, when I was building my contracting business, I faced systemic redlining and brutally discriminatory lending practices. Black business owners had to bleed for every single dollar of legitimate credit. I survived those brutal years by strictly managing my liabilities and never borrowing a single dime I could not pay back with my own sweat by Friday afternoon. Blake thought money was just a digital toy. He thought severe debt was just a number on a screen. He had absolutely no idea the kind of violent, unforgiving men he had gotten into bed with. Once Leon confirmed the existence of the debt, I made a highly strategic, ruthless business move. I used an anonymous proxy corporation to buy Blake's entire debt portfolio directly from the syndicate at a premium. I then immediately sold that exact debt contract to a fully licensed, ruthlessly aggressive commercial collection agency that specialized in extreme asset recovery and immediate wage garnishment. I bought the heavy noose he tied around his own neck, and I just handed the other end of the rope directly to the wolves. Inside the heavily fortified viewing room, Jada was screaming at the absolute top of her lungs, slamming the thick stack of papers repeatedly against Blake's chest. "You forged my name on this," she shrieked, her voice echoing violently off the steel vault walls. "You put $300,000 of criminal predatory debt entirely in my name. We are going to lose absolutely everything we have." Blake desperately tried to silence her, waving his hands frantically and begging her to keep her voice down, sweating profusely through his expensive designer suit. Right at that exact second of absolute uncontrollable chaos, Jada's cell phone began to ring loudly inside her leather handbag. The sharp, piercing ringtone cut right through their vicious screaming match. She pulled it out, looking at the unknown caller identification with wide, deeply terrified eyes. She answered the call and put it on speakerphone, her hand visibly shaking in the air. "Is this Jada Kensington?" A deep, incredibly gravelly voice demanded strictly through the speaker. "This is Apex Asset Recovery. Your joint account is severely delinquent on a $300,000 principal balance. We are initiating immediate asset seizure, full wage garnishment, and property liens starting today. We will be seeing you very soon." Jada dropped the phone onto the cold marble floor. She turned toward Blake, her eyes blazing with a feral, murderous rage I had never seen in her before. The fragile, toxic alliance they had built to destroy my life completely evaporated in a single instant. They were trapped inside a bank vault with absolutely no money, massive crushing debt, and a pack of hounds actively breaking down their door. They were finally turning their vicious fangs on each other, and my retaliation had only just begun. The walls were closing in on Blake Kensington with terrifying, suffocating speed. Tracked relentlessly by aggressive, highly organized debt collectors and facing the absolute destruction of his carefully fabricated luxury life, his cowardly survival instincts kicked into overdrive. I sat silently in my dark apartment listening to the crystal-clear wiretap audio Leon had expertly planted inside Blake's corporate office. It was late Tuesday evening, just 48 hours after the spectacular meltdown inside the bank vault. Blake was pacing his office floor like a trapped rabid animal, his breathing erratic and heavy. He made a highly encrypted phone call to a notoriously shady, unlicensed real estate broker known throughout the financial district for handling quiet, off-market liquidations for desperate clients facing impending bankruptcy, severe criminal charges, or ugly divorces. "Look, I need to offload the suburban estate immediately," Blake practically begged into the receiver, his voice trembling with sheer, unadulterated desperation. "It is a premium $2 million property in one of the most exclusive gated communities in the state, but I will sign the deed over for a straight $1.2 million in untraceable cash if we can legally close by this Friday." The sleazy broker on the other end of the line chuckled darkly, smelling the fresh blood in the water. "That is a massive, highly suspicious discount, Kensington. Are you trying to flee the state before the feds knock on your door?" Blake did not hesitate for a single second, completely discarding any remaining shred of human decency. "I am taking the cash, booking a one-way private flight to the Cayman Islands and leaving the country forever," he admitted coldly, his voice dripping with pure selfishness. "The $300,000 syndicate debt is entirely in my wife's name. They can strip her for parts and throw her to the wolves for all I care. I just need the massive cash wire cleared and deposited so I can completely disappear before the final legal asset freeze hits my personal accounts." Leon sat across from me at the small stained kitchen table, playing the intercepted audio file through a secure military-grade encrypted speaker. The former Marine sniper shook his head in absolute disgust as Blake's cowardly, vile betrayal echoed off the cheap walls of my temporary slum. "The guy is a complete, irredeemable rat," Leon stated flatly, aggressively closing his laptop. "He is literally preparing to fraudulently sell the house you bought out from under your own daughter, take the severely discounted cash for himself, and leave her to face violent loan sharks entirely alone. Do you want me to intercept the broker tonight and physically shut this illegal transaction down before he signs the paperwork?" I leaned back in my faded armchair, staring out the frosty window into the dark, unforgiving Chicago night. A slow, highly calculated, and utterly ruthless smile spread across my face. "Absolutely not," I replied, my voice dangerously calm and steady. "If you abruptly interrupt a desperate, cornered rat, he will just chew his way through the floorboards and find another unpredictable way out. We are not going to stop him. We are going to buy the house." Leon raised an eyebrow, clearly surprised by the sheer magnificent audacity of the strategic countermove. I picked up my phone and immediately dialed Richard, my elite, high-powered financial attorney. "Richard, I need you to instantly spin up a completely anonymous, airtight shell corporation registered in Delaware," I instructed flawlessly, my tone purely transactional. "Fund the entity with exactly $1.2 million from my primary untraceable holding account. Have your proxy agents contact Blake's shady broker first thing tomorrow morning and offer to buy the estate in a straight, uncompromising cash transaction. No contingencies, no extended inspections, just an immediate binding. Legal closing. Richard chuckled knowingly through the receiver, instantly grasping the sheer brilliance of the trap. You are going to let him believe he successfully orchestrated his own brilliant escape, Richard noted with deep professional admiration. Exactly, I said, my eyes entirely cold. We are going to let him meticulously dig his own grave, line it with his own forged signatures, and hand him the shovel to bury himself. Make sure the final closing is scheduled for this Friday at your downtown notary office. Do not leave a single fingerprint on the paperwork. After ending the call, I walked over to the small, cramped kitchen counter and poured 2 heavy glasses of aged top-shelf bourbon I had brought with me from my private reserve. I slid 1 glass across the table to Leon and took a slow, deliberate sip from my own. The rich, burning liquid warmed my chest, but my mind was utterly cold and deeply focused on absolute annihilation. When I was a young, struggling black contractor trying to aggressively break into the commercial real estate game in the early 1990s, the entire system was intentionally rigged to bleed us dry, I told Leon, looking directly into his sharp, analytical eyes. Corrupt city aldermen, racist bank managers, and mob-connected supply vendors used to set elaborate, devastating financial traps. They would dangle massive, highly lucrative municipal building contracts in front of minority-owned firms, wait for us to over-leverage our entire lives to buy the heavy industrial equipment, and then maliciously pull the funding at the very last second. They fully expected us to panic, declare immediate bankruptcy, and sell our expensive machinery back to their proxy companies for pennies on the dollar. Leon listened intently, taking a respectful sip of his bourbon. How did you beat a system that was entirely designed to destroy you, he asked. I beat them by understanding the fundamental psychology of a greedy, arrogant predator. I stated, setting my glass down with a heavy, definitive thud. If you try to block their scam directly with anger, they will just use their immense institutional power to crush you like a bug. The only way a black man survived the brutal, unforgiving corporate warfare of this city was to master the long game. You never aggressively block a rat's escape route. You build a brand new, highly polished tunnel that looks exactly like financial salvation. You paint it with the grand illusion of their own brilliant superiority, and you leave the heavy steel cage door wide open. You let them sprint joyfully into the darkness, completely convinced they outsmarted you. You wait patiently until they are entirely trapped in the concrete, and then you permanently seal the exit. Blake genuinely thinks he is playing 3-dimensional chess against a senile, outdated minority who does not understand modern finance. I am going to let him sign his own federal fraud conviction right in front of my eyes. The trap snapped shut with flawless, terrifying precision the very next afternoon. Leon hacked directly into the high-definition security cameras of a highly exclusive, discreet downtown cigar lounge where Blake was meeting his sleazy real estate broker to finalize the preliminary paperwork. I watched the live video feed on my tablet with total uncompromising focus as Blake greedily snatched the heavy gold pen and aggressively signed his forged signature across the binding memorandum of understanding. The proxy buyer representing my hidden shell corporation had already placed the massive, undeniable cash deposit into an offshore escrow account. Blake practically salivated like a starved animal as he looked at the official escrow confirmation glowing on his phone screen. This is the easiest $1.2 million I have ever made in my entire life, Blake boasted loudly, puffing on an expensive Cuban cigar and clinking his heavy crystal glass against the broker's drink. The final closing is officially set for Friday at noon. Make sure the wire transfer is staged for immediate, unhindered release the second the ink dries. The broker smirked widely, pocketing the signed, fraudulent contract. What about your wife? The broker asked, casually exhaling a thick cloud of smoke. Is she going to be a problem during the eviction process when the new owners take over? Blake let out a cruel, heartless laugh that completely and permanently solidified his impending catastrophic doom. As soon as that massive cash wire hits my offshore account, I am throwing my wife directly out onto the freezing street without a single penny. Blake sneered with absolute, unrestrained malice. She is a pathetic, completely useless anchor, and she is not my problem anymore. The violent pounding on my apartment door started just after 9 o'clock on a freezing Wednesday night. It was not the authoritative knock of law enforcement or the confident rap of a building manager. It was the frantic, chaotic hammering of a deeply terrified animal trying to escape a predator. I checked the live feed from the discreet security camera Leon had installed in the hallway ceiling. Jada was standing outside, her appearance completely unrecognizable from the pristine, arrogant socialite who had practically sneered at my existence just a few days ago. Her expensive cashmere coat was torn at the shoulder. Her hair was a tangled, disheveled mess, and her mascara was running down her cheeks in thick, dark streaks. She was hyperventilating, looking over her shoulder down the dim corridor every 2 seconds. I unlocked the deadbolt and slowly pulled the door open. Jada did not even wait for an invitation. She shoved past me, practically collapsing onto the cheap linoleum floor of my living room. She dropped to her knees, gripping the fabric of my faded jeans with shaking, desperate hands. "Dad, you have to help me!" she wailed, her voice cracking with pure, unadulterated hysteria. "They found me. They cornered me in the grocery store parking lot. 2 massive men in leather jackets blocked my car. They grabbed my wrist and told me that if I did not produce $50,000 in cash by Friday, they were going to start cutting off my fingers one by one. I am going to be mutilated. Please, you have to save me." She was sobbing hysterically, burying her face into my legs, playing the role of the innocent, victimized little girl who needed her strong father to chase the monsters away. "Blake did this to me," she screamed, pointing an accusatory finger at the empty air. "He is a monster. He forged my signature on those horrible syndicate loan documents. I had absolutely no idea he was gambling with the mafia. He manipulated me, Dad. He used me. I am entirely innocent in this. You have to believe me." I stood perfectly still, looking down at the weeping woman clinging to my knees. I did not reach down to stroke her hair. I did not offer her a glass of water to calm her nerves. I simply looked at her with the cold, analytical detachment of a man inspecting a deeply flawed structural foundation. She was performing exactly as I anticipated. The moment the consequences of her extreme greed became physically dangerous, she immediately tried to shift the entire burden of blame onto her husband, completely absolving herself of any malicious intent. She wanted me to believe she was just a naive, trusting wife who had been tragically led astray. I gently but firmly pried her hands off my legs and took a step back, forcing her to look up at my impassive face. I reached into the deep pocket of my flannel shirt and pulled out a small, highly advanced digital audio recorder. It was the exact same device Leon had expertly synced to the hidden microphones inside her luxury estate. I did not say a single word to her. I simply pressed the play button and turned the volume up to its maximum setting. The crisp, clear audio of Jada's own voice filled the tiny apartment, completely shattering her fabricated illusion of innocence. "You just need to make sure he drinks the entire glass." Blake's recorded voice echoed from the small speaker. "If he does not take the full sedative, the doctor cannot officially classify his cognitive decline and we cannot get the power of attorney." Then came Jada's response, recorded just hours before she brought me that laced chicken soup. "Do not worry about it, Blake. I will watch him swallow it myself. Once the old man is fully sedated and officially declared senile, we can finally take control of the house and liquidate his pathetic retirement accounts. He is useless to us anyway." I pressed the stop button, letting the deafening silence rush back into the room. All the color instantly drained from Jada's tear-stained face. Her mouth opened and closed silently like a suffocating fish. The elaborate theatrical performance she had just orchestrated completely evaporated. She stared at the small black device in my hand with wide, terrified eyes, realizing with absolute certainty that I knew every single dark, unforgivable secret she was harboring. "You were not manipulated, Jada," I stated, my voice dangerously soft and completely devoid of any parental warmth. "You were a fully willing, highly active participant in a conspiracy to permanently destroy my brain and steal my life savings." Jada scrambled backward on the floor, trying to put distance between us, her breathing shallow and ragged. "Dad, I can explain," she stammered desperately, her eyes darting around the room as if looking for an escape hatch. "It was the stress. Blake was pressuring me. We were drowning in debt and I panicked. I never actually wanted to hurt you." I slammed my heavy hand down on the small wooden coffee table, the sudden violent sound making her flinch hard. "Do not dare insult my intelligence by playing the victim," I commanded, my voice rumbling with decades of suppressed righteous fury. I spent my entire youth fighting through the systemic racism and brutal poverty of South Chicago. I bled on construction sites, breathing in toxic dust and breaking my own bones just so I could build an impenetrable financial fortress around you. I gave you elite private schools, designer clothes, and a life entirely, completely free from the bitter taste of discrimination that I had to swallow every single day. I did everything in my power to ensure you would walk through this world with pride and absolute dignity as a strong black woman. I stared down at her, letting the crushing weight of my disappointment fill the physical space between us. And what did you do with that magnificent privilege? You looked down on your own blood. You despised the blue-collar dirt under my fingernails because it embarrassed you in front of your arrogant country club friends. You chose to marry a mediocre, deeply racist white man who actively despises your heritage and treats your father like a stray animal. You worshipped his fabricated corporate status so much that you willingly helped him try to chemically lobotomize the very man who bought the roof over your head. You thought marrying into his world elevated you above me. Well, look at where his world has left you. Your husband used your name as a human shield against violent criminals, and now he is actively finalizing a secret deal to sell your house and flee the country with the cash, leaving you entirely alone to face the mafia butchers. Jada let out a guttural, agonizing gasp, grabbing her chest as if she had been physically shot. "He is leaving me," she whispered, the horrifying reality finally crashing down on her. "Yes," I replied coldly. "He is abandoning you to the wolves, and you absolutely deserve it. Now get up off my floor, go back out into the freezing street, and figure out how to pay off the syndicate, because I will not spend a single solitary penny of my hard-earned money to save a traitor." Jada reached out toward me, her hands trembling violently, tears streaming down her face in a continuous, pathetic river. "Daddy, please," she begged, her voice entirely broken and stripped of all her previous arrogance. "They are going to kill me. You cannot just leave me out there. You are my father." I looked down at the woman kneeling on my floor, searching my heart for any lingering trace of the blind, unconditional paternal leniency that had allowed this monster to grow in the first place. I found absolutely nothing but cold, unyielding resolve. "I was your father," I corrected her, my tone utterly final. "But you chose to make me your victim. I will not save you from the exact fate you so ruthlessly engineered for me. Get out of my apartment, Jada. Do not ever come back." I grabbed her by the arm, hauled her to her feet with undeniable physical strength, and marched her directly to the front door. I pushed her out into the freezing, poorly lit hallway. She turned around, opening her mouth to scream another desperate plea, but I slammed the heavy wooden door completely shut directly in her face. I engaged the deadbolt with a loud, definitive click. I stood there in the quiet of my apartment, listening intently to the muffled sounds on the other side of the door. Jada collapsed against the wood, sliding down to the floor. I could hear her weeping uncontrollably, letting out harsh, agonizing sobs of pure despair. She beat her fists against the door, crying out into the empty hallway as the crushing reality of her complete isolation settled in. She had systematically alienated the only man in the world who truly loved her, and now she was entirely alone in the dark, surrounded by the terrifying consequences of her own ruthless greed. I walked away from the door, my conscience perfectly clear, preparing for the final devastating phase of my retaliation against the man who started it all. The very next afternoon, the atmosphere inside the sleek, glass-walled executive lounge of Blake's prestigious downtown financial firm was electric with unearned celebration. Blake had organized an impromptu, highly lavish office party to commemorate what he believed was his ultimate masterstroke. He stood at the absolute center of the room, surrounded by a tight circle of his sycophantic junior colleagues, holding a crystal flute filled with expensive imported champagne. He was practically glowing with an arrogant, triumphant energy. In his mind, he had successfully orchestrated the perfect, flawless escape. He had signed the preliminary memorandum to sell my $2 million suburban estate for a severely discounted $1.2 million in untraceable cash. He fully believed the massive wire transfer would clear by Friday noon, allowing him to abandon his staggering syndicate debt, discard his terrified wife, and flee to a tropical tax haven to launch his own private equity firm. I sat in my quiet, poorly lit apartment watching the entire pathetic spectacle unfold live on my high-definition tablet. Leon had easily bypassed the firm's standard commercial firewall that morning, granting us complete unrestricted access to the high-resolution security cameras and the highly sensitive audio recording devices hidden deep inside the lounge ceiling. I watched Blake raise his glass, offering a smug, self-congratulatory toast to his own fabricated brilliance. He looked exactly like a man who had just conquered the entire world, completely oblivious to the fact that he was actually standing on a fragile trapdoor with the heavy release lever resting firmly in my calloused hands. As the afternoon wore on and the expensive champagne flowed freely, Blake's thin veneer of corporate professionalism completely dissolved. The alcohol rapidly lowered his inhibitions, peeling back the polished layers of his carefully manicured persona to reveal the ugly, rotting core of his true character. He began to boast loudly, holding court among his eager, deeply impressionable coworkers who hung on to his every word. He did not just brag about his upcoming real estate deal. He began to specifically and maliciously detail exactly how he acquired the property, painting himself as an elite apex predator who had easily outsmarted weak, uneducated prey. I turned the volume up to its maximum level on my tablet, ensuring I captured every single vile, unforgivable syllable. Blake laughed cruelly, leaning heavily against the polished marble bar, and began to openly mock me. He described me as a pathetic, outdated, ignorant old black man who had absolutely no concept of modern wealth management. He used deeply offensive, highly racially charged language, mocking my blue-collar background, my calloused hands, and my faded flannel shirts. He boasted to his colleagues about how incredibly easy it was to swindle an uneducated construction worker. He proudly detailed his malicious plan to hire a corrupt doctor, explicitly explaining how he intended to chemically sedate me and throw me into a locked psychiatric ward just to legally seize my hard-earned assets. He told the crowded room that people like me did not deserve to live in luxury, claiming that his superior intellect and corporate pedigree naturally entitled him to take what my decades of brutal labor had built. The sheer, unabashed prejudice and extreme malice in his voice were genuinely stomach-turning. He felt completely untouchable, wrapped tightly in a thick blanket of white privilege and corporate elitism, bragging about committing severe elder abuse and federal fraud as if it were a brilliant corporate acquisition strategy. His colleagues chuckled nervously, some too intimidated by his seniority to object, while others eagerly drank in his toxic, bigoted arrogance. I listened to his racist, venomous tirade with a profound, icy detachment. My hands did not shake. My heart rate did not elevate. I simply let his incredibly foolish words wash over me, knowing with absolute certainty that every single sentence he spoke was a massive iron nail securely driven into his own professional coffin. Blake had spent the last decade of his life desperately climbing the corporate ladder at this specific commercial leasing firm. He worshipped the brand, he worshipped the executive board, and he worshipped the massive end-of-year bonuses that allowed him to maintain his fake luxury lifestyle. He treated the company like his personal kingdom, convinced his fancy degree and his tailored suits made him a titan of the financial industry. What Blake did not know, what he could not possibly have comprehended in his wildest, most arrogant dreams, was the true history of the very building he was standing in. Decades ago, long before Blake had even graduated from his expensive business school, this firm was on the absolute brink of total financial collapse. They desperately needed an immediate, massive injection of anonymous capital to survive a hostile, predatory takeover. I was the man who provided that capital. Using a highly complex labyrinth of offshore holding companies and blind trusts managed exclusively by Richard I, purchased a commanding 60% majority ownership stake in the entire corporation. I was not just a prominent client. I was the absolute, undisputed phantom owner of the very firm Blake worshipped. I paid the commercial lease on that fancy executive lounge. I funded the vintage champagne he was currently drinking. And I personally authorized the paychecks of every single junior executive standing in that room, laughing at his racist jokes. He was a low-level, easily replaceable employee, standing in my house, drinking my wine, and calling me an ignorant, outdated fool. As Blake continued his drunken, highly incriminating monologue, the heavy glass doors of the executive lounge swung open. The chief executive officer of the firm, a stern, highly disciplined man named Bradley, walked into the room. The junior employees immediately straightened up, their nervous laughter dying instantly as they desperately tried to look professional. Bradley approached Blake with a warm, perfectly practiced corporate smile. He patted Blake firmly on the shoulder, offering a loud, enthusiastic congratulation on his upcoming independent business ventures and his supposedly brilliant real estate closing. Blake puffed his chest out proudly, soaking in the ultimate validation from his superior, genuinely believing he had secured the absolute pinnacle of corporate respect. Bradley offered one final polite nod before turning on his heel and walking out of the lounge, leaving Blake to bask in his fabricated glory. I watched the camera feed closely as Bradley strode briskly down the long, quiet executive corridor. He pulled a secure, encrypted mobile phone from his tailored suit pocket and dialed a direct line. The phone sitting on my small kitchen table vibrated instantly. I picked it up, keeping my eyes locked on the digital surveillance screen. Mr. Hayes Bradley said, his voice dropping, the friendly corporate facade completely shifting into a tone of absolute, unwavering respect. "The arrogant fool just confessed to multiple federal felonies on our recorded company servers. He took the bait entirely. Your trap is completely set." It was exactly noon on Friday when Blake strutted through the heavy glass doors of the premium downtown escrow office. The weather outside was a brutal Chicago freeze, but inside the luxurious mahogany-paneled conference room, the atmosphere was perfectly climate-controlled and smelled of expensive coffee and rich leather. Blake was dressed in his absolute best-tailored charcoal suit, his hair perfectly slicked back to project the image of a highly successful executive. He carried a sleek Italian leather briefcase that contained the fraudulent closing documents. Inside that smooth leather case rested the forged deeds, the falsified power of attorney, and the incredibly fake signatures he had meticulously practiced to steal my $2 million estate. He walked up to the massive polished conference table with the overwhelming swagger of a man who believed he had just successfully committed the perfect crime. Sitting across the table was a sharply dressed, completely stoic man named Harrison. Harrison was officially presenting himself as the chief acquisition agent for the anonymous Delaware shell corporation that was buying the property. What Blake did not know was that Harrison was actually one of Richard's most ruthless senior paralegals, handpicked by me to execute this final legal trap. The notary public, a quiet older woman, sat at the end of the table ready to stamp the final seals of his impending doom. Blake sat down, opened his briefcase with a loud, satisfying snap, and slid the thick stack of documents across the expansive table. He leaned back in his plush, ergonomic chair, crossing his legs with extreme arrogance. He genuinely thought he was the smartest person in the room. He believed he was just minutes away from securing a massive, untraceable cash wire that would fund his permanent escape to a tropical tax haven, leaving his wife to be destroyed by violent loan sharks, and his father-in-law locked inside a psychiatric ward. Harrison picked up the heavy stack of documents and began to review them with slow, excruciating precision. He turned each page deliberately, his eyes scanning the fraudulent ink and the meticulously forged signatures. Blake tapped his expensive leather shoe against the thick carpet, his leg bouncing with barely contained, greedy anticipation. Every second that ticked by on the heavy grandfather clock in the corner of the room felt like an absolute eternity to my desperate, cornered son-in-law. He was so blinded by his own extreme greed that he did not even bother to read the fine print on the final disclosure forms resting in front of him. Harrison finally reached the very last page. He pulled a heavy gold-plated fountain pen from his breast pocket, hovering the tip directly over the final buyer authorization line. He looked up, his face an unreadable, perfect poker mask, and offered Blake a polite, completely sterile corporate smile. "The paperwork appears to be entirely in order," Mr. Kensington Harrison stated smoothly, his voice devoid of any suspicion. "The title transfer is fully authorized, and the holding company is fully prepared to release the $1.2 million cash wire directly into your designated offshore account." Blake practically vibrated with pure, unadulterated joy. He leaned forward aggressively, snatching the gold pen from the table to apply his own final signature as the authorized seller. He scrawled his name across the bottom of the federal real estate transfer forms with rapid, forceful strokes. He was officially committing severe, undeniable federal wire fraud and grand theft real estate right in front of a licensed notary and a hidden array of high-definition surveillance cameras Leon had installed in the room the night before. Blake slammed the pen down on the table, exhaling a massive, heavy sigh of absolute relief. The deed was done. He had successfully stolen the massive suburban estate from his arrogant, uneducated father-in-law. "Send the wire transfer immediately," Blake demanded, his voice dripping with supreme, unwarranted authority. "I have a private flight leaving out of Midway Airport in exactly 3 hours, and I want to see the cleared funds sitting safely in my account before my wheels leave the tarmac." As Harrison turned to his secure laptop to supposedly initiate the massive transfer of funds, Blake allowed himself to bask in the warm, intoxicating glow of his fabricated victory. He looked out the expansive floor-to-ceiling windows at the towering Chicago skyline, firmly believing he had conquered the entire city. He thought back to the freezing Tuesday night when he had mercilessly kicked my heart medication across the hardwood floor. He remembered the look of quiet defeat on my face when I walked out into the snow, and he felt a profound, overwhelming sense of superiority. In his deeply racist, highly arrogant mind, he was the natural winner. He was the educated white corporate executive, and I was just an outdated blue-collar black man who had gotten incredibly lucky in the construction business. Blake truly believed that my decades of backbreaking labor hauling steel and inhaling concrete dust in the brutal South Side neighborhoods were ultimately meant to serve him. He believed that my massive wealth was his fundamental birthright simply because he had managed to marry my deeply flawed daughter. He thought my silence was weakness and my patience was pure stupidity. He had no concept of the profound calculating endurance required to survive the violent, deeply corrupt commercial real estate wars of the 1980s. I fought off aggressive mob extortion and racially motivated zoning boards. I built towering skyscrapers while he was still a child playing in a sandbox. He had absolutely no idea that while he was busy playing corporate dress-up with a fraudulent title, I had spent the last 40 years building an impenetrable fortress of wealth, influence, and raw power. He thought he was actively dismantling my life when in reality he was just a minor pest, walking blindly into a highly sophisticated multi-million-dollar extermination trap. I had engineered this exact moment to completely destroy his fragile ego and permanently erase his existence from my family tree. Blake smiled at his reflection in the glass, imagining the warm beaches of the Cayman Islands completely oblivious to the massive, catastrophic storm that was currently bearing down on his exact location. Harrison tapped the final key on his laptop. A soft, pleasant chime echoed from the computer speakers. The large digital monitor mounted on the conference room wall flashed a bright green confirmation message. Wire transfer of $1.2 million initiated and complete. Blake let out a loud, victorious laugh. He immediately pulled his expensive mobile phone from his pocket and opened his highly secure offshore banking application to verify the massive deposit. The screen loaded for a brief, agonizing second. Blake stared at the glowing numbers, expecting to see his ultimate financial salvation. Instead, his victorious smile instantly evaporated, replaced by a look of sheer, suffocating terror. The account balance read 0. He frantically refreshed the application, his fingers shaking violently against the glass screen. A stark, bright red notification banner aggressively popped up across the top of his banking dashboard. The message was explicitly clear and completely devastating. Warning: this account has been permanently frozen. All assets are currently under immediate seizure and extreme lockdown by the Federal Bureau of Investigation and the Department of Financial Crimes. Please surrender yourself to local authorities immediately. Blake dropped his phone onto the polished mahogany table, his entire body trembling as the absolute horror of his catastrophic failure finally set in. The suffocating silence inside the luxurious downtown escrow office was violently broken by the sound of Blake's frantic, shallow breathing. He stood completely frozen, his eyes wide and bloodshot, staring at the glowing red notification on his smartphone. The offshore account that was supposed to hold his stolen $1.2 million salvation was permanently locked down by federal authorities. He desperately tapped the screen, his manicured fingers slipping against the glass, quietly muttering to himself that it had to be a routing error, a temporary bank glitch, or a simple mistake by the holding company. He looked up at Harrison, ready to aggressively demand that the massive wire transfer be reissued immediately. But before a single arrogant word could escape his trembling lips, the heavy, solid mahogany doors of the executive conference room were thrown open with a resounding, thunderous crash. The sudden, violent noise rattled the expensive crystal water glasses on the table. Blake spun around, ready to scream at whatever intern or security guard had dared to interrupt his closing. Instead, the words completely died in his throat. Stepping through the wide doorway was a man Blake barely recognized. It was me. But I was no longer wearing the faded flannel shirts, the dusty work jeans, or the scuffed steel toe boots that Blake had mocked for years. I was dressed in a flawless, bespoke midnight blue Italian wool suit perfectly tailored to my broad shoulders. A crisp white silk shirt, a subtle silver tie, and a gleaming ultra-rare Patek Philippe watch rested effortlessly on my wrist. I walked into the room with the undeniable gravitational authority of an apex predator returning to his throne. Flanking my right side was Richard, my elite financial attorney, carrying a thick black leather litigation portfolio and wearing a predatory smirk. Flanking my left were two highly decorated, heavily armed officers from the Federal Financial Crimes Division, their badges catching the overhead lights. Blake's brain completely short-circuited. He took a stumbling step backward, his expensive leather shoes sliding awkwardly against the plush carpet. He pointed a shaking, accusatory finger directly at my chest. "What the hell is this?" Blake screamed, his voice cracking into a high, hysterical pitch. "What are you doing here, you crazy old man? How did you get past security?" He whipped his head around to glare at Harrison, who was calmly closing his laptop. "Call building security right now. This man is severely mentally ill. He is legally incompetent and suffering from advanced dementia. He wandered away from his slum and he needs to be physically removed from this premises immediately." Harrison did not reach for the phone. Instead, he smoothly buttoned his suit jacket, stood up from his chair, and walked directly around the large table to stand respectfully behind my right shoulder. Blake's jaw dropped. His arrogant eyes darted wildly between Harrison Richard and the two stern federal officers blocking the only exit. "This is a private, highly secure real estate closing," Blake shouted, his panic rapidly escalating into a full-blown meltdown. "I am the legal owner of that suburban estate. I just signed the binding federal transfer documents. The funds have already been authorized. You cannot legally be in this room." Richard stepped forward, exuding the terrifying, lethal confidence of a man who destroys corporate empires for a living. He opened his black leather portfolio and pulled out a pristine, beautifully embossed stack of original property deeds. "Actually, Mr. Kensington," Richard stated, his voice echoing with absolute uncompromising legal authority, "you are not the owner of that estate. You were never the owner of that estate. My firm represents the Apex Legacy Trust, the sole undisputed legal entity that holds the deed to the property in question. And the man standing in front of you is the sole executor, primary beneficiary, and absolute chairman of that trust." Richard casually tossed the authentic, unredacted trust documents directly onto the polished mahogany table right next to the fraudulent papers Blake had just enthusiastically signed. "Your wife Jada was merely listed as a permitted non-equity resident for tax structuring purposes," Richard continued, twisting the metaphorical knife. "She never held the legal right to sell, mortgage, or transfer a single square inch of that property. Therefore, the heavily forged power of attorney you presented to this notary today is entirely worthless. And that highly binding federal real estate transfer form you just eagerly signed with your own hand. That is not a closing document, Mr. Kensington. That is a textbook, perfectly documented open and shut confession to severe federal wire fraud and attempted grand theft real estate." I slowly walked to the head of the conference table, placing my hands firmly on the polished wood. Blake was trembling so violently that his knees buckled, forcing him to grip the back of his chair just to stay standing. The supreme, unwarranted white corporate privilege that had shielded him his entire life had just been completely pulverized. "You looked at my calloused hands, my old truck, and my quiet demeanor, and you saw an uneducated servant you could easily discard," I said, my voice rumbling with decades of quiet, lethal power. "You thought because I did not brag about my bank accounts at country club dinners, I was a weak, outdated black man, ripe for the slaughter. But while you were taking out highly predatory loans from mafia thugs to gamble on cheap crypto, I was buying the banks that hold your corporate debt. While you were leasing luxury cars to impress junior executives, I was the phantom majority shareholder signing your paycheck." I leaned in closer, making sure he felt the absolute crushing weight of my presence. "I survived the most brutal, deeply racist commercial construction wars in the history of Chicago," I stated, my eyes locking onto his terrified, shrinking pupils. "I laid the massive concrete foundations of the towering glass high-rises you work in. I fought off corrupt politicians and mob enforcers before you were even born. And you truly believed you could legally lobotomize me with a bribed doctor and steal the home I paid for with straight cash 30 years ago. I let you walk into this room. I let you sit in that chair. I let you sign your name on that federal document because a greedy, arrogant rat will never truly believe he is trapped until he actually hears the heavy steel cage click permanently shut. You wanted to play the role of the ruthless corporate titan Blake. Welcome to the major leagues." The horrifying, inescapable reality of the situation completely crushed Blake's chest. He looked down at the forged signature on the federal transfer document, realizing that his own ink had just condemned him to a decade in a federal penitentiary. He began to hyperventilate desperately, looking around the room for a non-existent escape hatch. "It was not my idea," Blake stammered pathetically, instantly trying to throw his own wife under the bus, just as he had planned to do all along. "Jada orchestrated the entire thing. She told me the house was hers. She found the doctor. I am just a victim of her manipulation." The two federal officers stepped forward in absolute unison, their faces entirely devoid of any human sympathy. The distinctive, terrifying metallic click of heavy steel handcuffs being unholstered echoed sharply in the quiet, luxurious room. Blake Kensington, the lead officer, commanded, his voice booming with absolute, uncompromising authority. "You are under arrest for federal wire fraud, severe identity theft, and attempted grand larceny. Put your hands behind your back immediately." The distinctive, terrifying metallic click of heavy steel handcuffs being unholstered echoed sharply in the quiet room. Before the federal officers could advance on the trembling, cornered coward, a sudden commotion erupted in the reception area outside. The heavy mahogany doors burst open for a second time. Jada stumbled into the executive conference room, her breathing ragged, her designer clothes completely disheveled. Driven to the absolute brink of insanity by the looming threat of the violent loan sharks I had set upon her, she had frantically tracked her husband's location through his shared corporate calendar, desperately seeking the man she believed was her final lifeline. She froze in the doorway, her wide, bloodshot eyes darting from the federal agents to Richard and finally landing on me, standing tall and immaculate in my bespoke suit. But before my daughter could even process the horrifying reality of the room, Blake made a move so profoundly pathetic it disgusted even the hardened federal agents. He lunged forward, grabbed Jada roughly by the arm, and violently yanked her in front of his own body, literally using his weeping wife as a human shield. "It was not me," Blake shrieked, his voice cracking with pure, unadulterated cowardice as he pointed a shaking finger over Jada's shoulder. "She is the mastermind. She orchestrated the entire fraud. She brought the fake doctor to the apartment, she forged the power of attorney, and she explicitly told me the house was legally hers to sell. I am completely innocent. I am a victim of her financial manipulation." "Arrest her." Jada gasped, her body going completely rigid as the absolute betrayal of her husband's words washed over her. She turned her head slowly, looking at the man she had idolized, the man she had helped poison her own father for, completely paralyzed by his breathtaking treachery. I did not raise my voice. I simply gave a subtle, practiced nod to Harrison. Moving with the smooth efficiency of a highly paid corporate operative, Harrison stepped over to the mahogany media console built into the wall. He tapped a sleek digital interface, instantly dimming the recessed overhead lights and lowering a massive high-definition projection screen from the ceiling directly behind the conference table. The room was plunged into cinematic darkness, illuminated only by the glaring bright light of the projector. A crystal-clear, high-resolution video file began to play, accompanied by pristine, undeniably crisp audio. The screen displayed the interior of the highly exclusive downtown cigar lounge from just 2 days prior. There was Blake lounging arrogantly in a leather wingback chair, puffing on an expensive Cuban cigar and clinking a heavy crystal glass with the sleazy, unlicensed real estate broker. The federal officers paused, watching the screen intently. Jada stood absolutely frozen, her eyes glued to the massive projection of her husband. The audio echoed through the silent conference room, capturing every single vile, unforgivable word of Blake's ultimate betrayal. "I am taking the cash, booking a one-way private flight to the Cayman Islands and leaving the country forever," Blake's recorded voice boasted, loudly, dripping with pure selfishness. "The $300,000 syndicate debt is entirely in my wife's name. They can strip her for parts and throw her to the wolves for all I care. I just need the massive cash wire cleared and deposited so I can completely disappear." The sleazy broker on the screen chuckled, asking what would happen to Jada when the new owners took over the estate. "As soon as that massive cash wire hits my offshore account, I am throwing my wife directly out onto the freezing street without a single penny," Blake's digital counterpart sneered with absolute unrestrained malice. "She is a pathetic, completely useless anchor, and she is not my problem anymore." The video faded to black and the bright overhead lights slowly hummed back to life. Jada stood rooted to the spot, her entire body trembling so violently I thought her bones might shatter. She slowly turned to face me. The devastating realization of her own monumental failure was written entirely across her tear-stained face. She had worshipped this man. She had looked at my calloused hands, hands that had bled mixing concrete and laying steel across the brutal south side of Chicago to build her an impenetrable financial fortress. And she had felt nothing but deep, agonizing shame. She had desperately craved the hollow, fabricated prestige of Blake's white corporate world, willingly trading her royal bloodline and her father's unconditional love for a man who fundamentally despised her heritage. "You chose to be a servant in his world rather than a queen in mine," I said. my voice dangerously soft but striking her soul with the devastating force of a sledgehammer. You threw away the proud, unyielding legacy of a black family that survived decades of systemic starvation just to impress a mediocre parasite who secretly views you as a disposable piece of trash. You helped him try to chemically destroy my brain, Jada. And for what? So he could steal my money and leave you to be butchered by the mafia. You sold your own father to a coward who would not even stand beside you when the walls closed in. The agonizing, undeniable truth of my words completely shattered the final remnants of her sanity. Jada let out a guttural, terrifying scream that sounded like a wounded animal. She spun around and launched herself directly at Blake. She tackled him with a sudden, ferocious surge of hysterical strength, slamming him hard against the edge of the heavy mahogany table. "You lying, cowardly monster!" She shrieked, her hands curling into vicious claws as she aggressively raked her nails deeply across his pristine, arrogant face. "You used me. You ruined my entire life." The sheer violence of Jada's sudden assault completely caught Blake off guard. He stumbled backward, shrieking in pain as her nails left deep, bloody scratches across his cheek and neck. The two federal officers immediately sprang into action. They surged forward, grabbing Jada by the shoulders and forcefully peeling her off her bleeding husband, dragging her hysterical, thrashing body to the far side of the room. The lead officer did not hesitate for another second. He grabbed Blake by the lapels of his ruined, custom-tailored suit, spun him around violently, and slammed him face first into the surface of the polished conference table. Blake gasped as the breath was knocked completely out of his lungs. The officer drove his heavy knee directly into the center of Blake's back, pinning him to the wood, and forcefully wrenched his arms behind him. The heavy steel handcuffs clicked shut around his wrists with a harsh, final finality. Pinned to the table, his face pressed against the fraudulent documents he had just signed, Blake's arrogant delusion somehow miraculously persisted. He craned his neck, looking up at me with eyes filled with pure, unadulterated hatred and desperate, manic denial. "You think you have won? You outdated old fool!" Blake screamed, his voice echoing frantically through the room as the officers hauled him roughly to his feet. "My firm is a financial titan. I am a senior executive. When my chief executive officer finds out what you did, he will send the most vicious, high-powered corporate defense lawyers in the entire city to bail me out. They will absolutely crush you in court. You just wait." Blake thrashed against the iron grip of the federal agents, his expensive leather shoes scrambling desperately for traction on the plush carpet. Blood from the deep, vicious scratches Jada had just carved into his face trickled down his neck, staining his pristine white silk collar. Yet even in the face of absolute, undeniable ruin, his blinding arrogance refused to die. He genuinely believed that his fabricated white-collar prestige made him fundamentally untouchable by the consequences of his own actions. "You have absolutely no idea who you are dealing with." Blake spat, his chest heaving as he glared at me with feral, desperate hatred. "I am a top-tier senior vice president at a massive, multi-billion-dollar financial institution. I generate millions of dollars in revenue every single quarter. When my chief executive officer Bradley hears that some uneducated, outdated construction worker tried to frame me for a real estate scam, he will unleash an army of corporate defense attorneys. They will completely destroy your bogus trust fund. They will sue you into absolute poverty, and I will walk out of that courthouse a free, incredibly wealthy man. You cannot touch me. I belong to a world you could not possibly comprehend." I did not flinch. I did not raise my voice to argue with a cornered, delusional rat. I simply reached inside the breast pocket of my bespoke midnight blue suit and pulled out my encrypted high-security mobile phone. I tapped the glowing screen once, opening my contact list, and pressed the speakerphone button. I held the device out in the quiet, tense air of the mahogany conference room, letting the dial tone ring out loudly for everyone to hear. Blake let out a harsh, mocking laugh, completely convinced I was making a pathetic last-ditch effort to call a cheap strip mall lawyer to negotiate a surrender. "Let me guess." Blake sneered, his voice dripping with unrestrained malice. "You are calling that shady $2 attorney you hired to scare me in your dirty little slum. Go ahead, call him. It will not save you." The phone rang a second time. On the third ring, the line clicked open. A deep, highly authoritative, and instantly recognizable voice filled the expansive room. "Good afternoon, Mr. Chairman," the voice said, exuding absolute, uncompromising respect. "Is the pest control operation fully complete?" Blake's mocking laughter died instantly in his throat. The remaining color completely drained from his scratched, bleeding face. His eyes went wide with pure, unadulterated horror. He recognized that commanding voice immediately. It was Bradley, the ruthless chief executive officer of his prestigious financial firm, the very man Blake had just confidently boasted would send an army of lawyers to save him. "It is complete." "Bradley," I replied, my voice smooth, cold, and entirely devoid of mercy. "You may go ahead and deliver the final news to our former associate." I lowered the phone slightly, aiming the speaker directly at Blake's pale, trembling face. There was a brief, agonizing pause on the other end of the line. "Kensington, you absolute monumental fool," Bradley stated, his voice stripped of all its usual corporate warmth, replaced entirely by pure lethal disgust. "You are officially terminated from this firm, effective immediately with extreme cause. Our internal forensic auditors have spent the last 48 hours tearing through your accounts. We have already forwarded your extensive, highly documented embezzlement records, your falsified expense reports, and your fraudulent wire transfers directly to the federal authorities currently holding you in custody. You are completely toxic, Kensington. And by the way," Bradley added, his tone shifting back to profound reverence, "thank you, Mr. Chairman, for allowing us to finally take out the garbage. I will see you at the board meeting on Tuesday." I tapped the screen, disconnecting the call. The silence that rushed back into the room was incredibly heavy, suffocating, and absolute. Blake stood perfectly still, his brain completely breaking as he tried to process the catastrophic cognitive dissonance of the last 60 seconds. The cognitive shock was almost physically painful to witness. The pathetic, senile, blue-collar black man he had despised, mocked, and actively tried to chemically lobotomize was not a victim. I was the supreme, undisputed chairman of his entire corporate universe. "You thought you were a self-made titan of industry," I said, taking a slow, deliberate step toward him, forcing him to shrink back into the grip of the federal agents. "You bragged to your junior executives about swindling an uneducated old man. You drank expensive vintage champagne in a luxury executive lounge, completely oblivious to the fact that I personally pay the commercial lease on that entire building. When the financial market collapsed back in 2008 and your prestigious firm was hours away from total bankruptcy, I bought a controlling 60% ownership stake in the entire corporation through anonymous offshore holding companies. I saved that company from the ashes, using the exact same fortune I built, pouring concrete and laying steel across the freezing, unforgiving south side of Chicago." I leaned in closer, my eyes locking onto his terrified, completely broken pupils. "You collected your massive, unearned end-of-year bonuses simply because my digital signature was stamped on the bottom of the corporate ledger. You drove a $100,000 luxury car because my holding company generously authorized the lease to keep my daughter happy. You demanded I pick up my life-saving heart medication from your pristine hardwood floor, completely blind to the fact that you were standing on a floor I bought, living a luxury life I entirely subsidized. You genuinely believed your white-collar status and your expensive business degree made you fundamentally superior to a man who works with his hands. But you were never a King Blake. You were nothing but a highly paid, easily replaceable servant operating inside my kingdom. I let you climb the corporate ladder just high enough to ensure that when I finally kicked the ladder out from under you, the fall would permanently and irreparably break your neck." The inescapable, crushing weight of his absolute destruction finally hit Blake all at once. His legs completely gave out beneath him. The two federal agents had to quickly adjust their grip, violently hauling him up by his armpits to keep his knees from slamming into the floor. He was no longer an arrogant, aggressive executive. He was a hollow, entirely broken shell of a man facing decades in a federal penitentiary. He stared at me with empty, vacant eyes, his jaw trembling silently, completely unable to form a single coherent word. He had absolutely no house, no money, no job, no wife, and no freedom. The lead federal agent did not offer a single ounce of sympathy. He shoved Blake roughly forward toward the heavy mahogany doors, dragging his dead, unresisting weight across the plush carpet. The doors swung open and slammed shut behind them with a loud, definitive thud. The arrogant monster who had tried to steal my life was permanently gone, leaving only the sound of Jada's quiet, terrified sobbing echoing from the far corner of the room. The heavy mahogany doors clicked shut, plunging the executive conference room into a suffocating, terrifying stillness. The federal agents, my ruthless attorney Richard the Silent Notary, and the ruined handcuffed remains of Blake Kensington were completely gone. The only sound left in the massive, luxurious space was the ragged, hysterical sobbing of my only daughter. Jada was still crumpled on the plush carpet where she had collapsed after viciously attacking her husband. Her expensive designer dress was violently wrinkled and stained with her tears, her premium high heels cast aside like discarded trash. She looked up at me, her eyes wide, bloodshot, and completely, utterly desperate. The flawless facade of the untouchable corporate socialite was entirely shattered, leaving behind nothing but a terrified, highly vulnerable child who had just watched her entire fabricated reality burn to the ground. She crawled frantically across the floor, her hands reaching out to grab the perfectly tailored fabric of my midnight blue suit trousers. She buried her tear-streaked face against my legs, weeping with a profound, agonizing terror that visibly shook her entire frame. "Daddy, please," she choked out between violent, racking sobs. "You have to save me from them. Blake forged my signature on those horrible, predatory syndicate loans. The men who called me the brutal debt collectors, they know exactly who I am. They know exactly where I go. They explicitly told me they are going to physically mutilate me if I do not produce $300,000 by tomorrow morning. I do not have that kind of cash. My personal accounts are completely frozen by the feds. My credit cards are entirely dead. You are the absolute only one who can fix this. You have tens of millions of dollars. You secretly own his entire company. Just pay the debt, Daddy. Please just wire the funds and make those violent monsters go away. I will do anything you want. I will be the perfect, obedient daughter. Just please do not let them hurt me." I did not wrap my arms around her trembling shoulders. I did not offer her a warm, forgiving embrace or a comforting whisper telling her everything would magically be okay. I did not show a single ounce of the blind, unconditional parental leniency that had allowed this monster to grow inside my house. Instead, I reached down and firmly grasped her chin with my heavily calloused fingers. I tilted her head up forcefully, forcing her bloodshot, terrified eyes to lock directly onto mine. She was desperately searching my face for salvation. She was looking for the soft, highly accommodating father who always rushed in to quickly clean up her catastrophic financial messes with a blank check and a heavy, defeated sigh. She found absolutely nothing but glacial, uncompromising ice. The man looking back at her was not the soft, elderly target she had eagerly tried to chemically lobotomize. It was the apex predator who had just ruthlessly decimated her arrogant husband, Jada. I said, my voice dangerously even and devoid of any human warmth. "You are bleeding on the very floor of the financial fortress I built, begging for the exact same wealth you actively, maliciously plotted to steal from me. You sat in my house eating food purchased entirely with my money, and you deliberately poured a highly dangerous, mind-destroying sedative into my water glass. You looked at the man who carried you as a baby, and you consciously chose to treat him like a disposable piece of trash just to impress a racist, mediocre coward who threw you to the wolves the very second his own freedom was threatened. You are not begging for forgiveness because you feel genuine moral remorse for your unforgivable betrayal. You are begging for a massive financial bailout because you are completely terrified of the brutal physical consequences of your own vicious actions. You made a highly calculated, malicious choice to climb into the gutter with a diseased rat. Now you are absolutely shocked that you are covered in filth and cornered by feral, starving dogs." She gasped, fresh tears spilling over my fingers, desperately shaking her head in a pathetic, weak attempt at denial. I tightened my grip slightly, ensuring she absorbed every single syllable of her impending doom. I spent 4 decades breaking my own back in the freezing, brutal winters of South Chicago. I continued, my voice echoing with the crushing weight of 1,000 unpaid, agonizing debts. I endured the violent, systemic racism of corrupt municipal building inspectors, deeply prejudiced commercial bankers, and violent union mobs. I swallowed my intense pride, I bled on rusted steel rebar, and I built an underground real estate empire entirely from scratch so that you would never ever have to experience the bitter, dehumanizing taste of extreme poverty. I gave you elite private schools, pristine ballet shoes, and absolute financial invulnerability. I desperately tried to buy your dignity, but your late mother, Diane, was completely, tragically right. You cannot buy strong moral character for someone who fundamentally lacks a soul. You took the magnificent, impenetrable royal armor I built for you, and you eagerly traded it for a cheap plastic crown in a fake, highly toxic white-collar kingdom. You looked down on the very black blood pumping through your own veins. You wanted to be recognized as a high society elite so desperately that you happily traded your own father's sanity for a permanent seat at their snobby prejudice table. Well, you are officially sitting at the table, Jada, and the massive, crushing bill has finally arrived. I let go of her chin, abruptly stepping back so she fell forward, catching herself hard on the floor with her bare hands. I am not going to pay the criminal syndicate a single, solitary dime of my money, I declared, sealing her fate with absolute, terrifying certainty. You are going to go out into the real world and get a minimum wage job. You are going to scrub filthy floors, wash greasy dishes, or flip burgers on a hot grill. You are going to set up a rigid, highly aggressive payment plan with the collection agency, and you are going to personally pay back every single penny of that $300,000 debt with your own physical labor. If they aggressively repossess your expensive designer clothes, you will wear rags. If they forcefully take your diamond jewelry, you will walk bare. And that beautiful $2 million suburban estate you and your cowardly husband aggressively tried to sell out from under me. I legally transferred the complete, irrevocable deed to a local foundation for orphaned children early this morning. You have absolutely nothing left to steal. Jada let out a harrowing, blood-curdling scream of pure, absolute devastation. She curled into a tight, violently trembling ball on the luxurious carpet, pulling her own hair as the suffocating, inescapable reality of her new, brutal life violently crushed her. She was entirely bankrupt, deeply and dangerously in debt to violent underground criminals, and permanently exiled from the massive multi-million-dollar fortune she had spent her entire life arrogantly taking for granted. She reached out one final desperate time, her manicured fingers clawing weakly at the empty air where I used to stand. "Daddy, you cannot do this to me," she wailed, her voice tearing at her throat. "I will not survive out there on the streets. I do not know how to work like that. You are literally sentencing me to death." I paused at the heavy mahogany doors, calmly adjusting the perfectly tailored cuffs of my bespoke suit. I did not look back at the broken, weeping woman completely shattered on the floor. I survived the absolute worst, most violent streets of this city with absolutely nothing but a rusted hammer and my own sheer, unrelenting willpower. I said, my voice cold, final, and absolute. "It is time you finally learn how to swing one." I stepped out of the grand conference room and pulled the heavy doors firmly shut behind me. The loud, definitive click of the latch echoed through the corridor, like a heavy iron prison cell locking permanently into place, leaving her entirely alone in the dark to face the monsters she had invited in. 3 months later, the sterile, heavily wood-paneled walls of the federal courthouse in downtown Chicago felt like a pressurized vacuum. I sat perfectly still in the front row of the gallery wearing a pristine charcoal suit, watching the final, desperate thrashing of a completely ruined man. Blake sat at the defense table. The 3 months in a federal holding cell had entirely stripped him of his corporate arrogance. His expensive haircut was gone, his posture was violently hunched, and the bespoke Italian suits had been permanently replaced by an oversized standard-issue orange jumpsuit. Yet even facing a mountain of undeniable federal evidence, his high-priced, slick defense attorney attempted a final, deeply offensive legal maneuver. The defense lawyer stood before the diverse 12-person jury, desperately trying to rewrite the entire narrative. He paced the floor, weaving a sickeningly fabricated tale of reverse discrimination and entrapment. He pointed a perfectly manicured finger directly at me, painting me as a bitter, vengeful billionaire who fundamentally hated his white son-in-law. He told the jury that I had maliciously orchestrated a highly complex, multi-million-dollar trap purely to destroy an innocent, naive corporate executive who was just trying to manage his ailing father-in-law's estate. He claimed Blake was the true victim, targeted and financially ruined by an angry black father who never approved of the interracial marriage. It was a vile, incredibly desperate attempt to weaponize race and twist the facts, hoping to find just one sympathetic juror willing to believe the myth of the victimized white professional. The federal prosecutor did not even bother to argue with the offensive narrative. He simply stood up, adjusted his glasses, and called Richard to the stand to authenticate the final piece of digital evidence. Richard strode to the witness box with the lethal, terrifying confidence of a shark smelling fresh blood in the water. The prosecutor submitted a verified, encrypted audio file directly into the court record. It was the flawless, high-definition recording Leon had captured from the ceiling of the executive lounge on the day of Blake's arrogant office party. The prosecutor pressed play, and Blake's own drunken, highly amplified voice echoed off the high ceilings of the federal courtroom. The jury listened in absolute horrified silence as Blake's voice slurred through the speakers, bragging loudly to his junior colleagues about swindling an uneducated, outdated old black man. Every single vicious, highly offensive racial slur he had casually thrown around the lounge echoed perfectly in the quiet courtroom. But the absolute devastation came when the audio shifted to Blake explicitly detailing his malicious plan to hire a corrupt mob-indebted doctor. The jury heard him gleefully explain exactly how he intended to chemically lobotomize me, lock me in a state-run psychiatric ward, and illegally seize the $2 million suburban estate. The horrific, undeniable premeditation of elder abuse and federal fraud was laid completely bare. I watched the faces of the jury members contort into expressions of pure, unadulterated disgust. Several jurors physically recoiled, shaking their heads and glaring at the defense table. The slick defense attorney instantly turned a sickly shade of gray, dropping his pen onto the table, as he realized his entire fabricated victimhood defense had just been incinerated by his own client's recorded arrogance. Blake buried his face in his trembling hands, desperately trying to hide from the crushing weight of his exposed bigotry and inescapable guilt. Before the sentencing phase concluded, the federal judge allowed me to take the stand to deliver my formal victim impact statement. I walked slowly and deliberately to the wooden box, resting my large calloused hands on the railing. I did not look at the jury. I locked my eyes directly onto Blake, forcing him to lift his head and face the man he had tried to destroy. I did not raise my voice. I spoke with a low, rumbling cadence that carried the immense, crushing weight of 40 years of brutal survival. Your lawyer stood in this room and tried to paint you as the naive victim of a vengeful, prejudiced black mogul. I stated, my voice slicing through the heavy silence of the courtroom like a frozen blade. You want this jury to believe you were trapped, but you do not know the first thing about being trapped, Blake. When I was a young man in the 1980s trying to build a legitimate commercial construction business on the south side of Chicago, I faced genuine systemic traps every single day. I had corrupt, racist bank managers deny me equipment loans to my face. I had union mobsters physically threaten my life for bidding on downtown contracts. I bled into the concrete, I breathed in toxic dust, and I worked 100-hour weeks just to force my way into rooms that were intentionally locked to men who looked like me. I built an impenetrable financial empire through sheer uncompromising willpower and an absolute refusal to be a victim. I leaned forward slightly, ensuring every single syllable struck his fragile ego with maximum kinetic force. You were born on third base and genuinely thought you hit a triple. You used my daughter's deep-seated insecurities as a weapon to infiltrate my family. You looked at my quiet demeanor and my faded clothes, and you assumed my silence was the silence of a subjugated, outdated servant. You thought you could simply wave a forged piece of paper and erase 4 decades of my blood and sweat. You stood in a luxury executive lounge that I personally owned, drinking champagne that I paid for, and you used racial slurs to mock the very man who subsidized your entire fraudulent existence. You are not a victim of reverse discrimination, Blake. You are a victim of your own breathtaking, insurmountable stupidity and your fundamental lack of a soul. You brought a cheap plastic shovel to dig a grave for a man who owns the entire concrete factory. I am not standing here as a victim of your pathetic financial crimes. I am standing here as the absolute architect of your permanent destruction. The federal judge leaned forward, his face a mask of absolute, uncompromising judicial authority. He looked down at the broken, trembling shell of the man sitting at the defense table with visible contempt. Blake Kensington. The judge's voice boomed across the silent room, dropping the final, inescapable anvil on my son-in-law's life. For the charges of severe federal wire fraud, attempted grand larceny, identity theft, and conspiracy to commit elder abuse, I find you completely devoid of any redeeming moral character. You orchestrated a malicious, highly predatory scheme to medically and financially destroy an elderly man who offered you nothing but a roof over your head. The judge slammed his heavy wooden gavel down onto the sounding block with a sharp, violent crack that made Blake physically jump in his seat. I hereby sentence you to 15 years in a maximum security federal penitentiary. There will be absolutely no possibility of early parole. The heavy steel handcuffs were aggressively snapped back onto Blake's wrists by the waiting federal marshals. As they violently hauled him up from his chair and dragged him toward the heavy side door leading to the holding cells, Blake twisted his neck, looking back at me one final time. His eyes were wide, completely filled with pure, unadulterated terror and the absolute crushing despair of a man who realized his life was permanently and irrevocably over. I did not smile. I did not blink. I simply adjusted the cuff of my bespoke jacket and watched the heavy wooden door slam shut permanently, erasing him from my world. The harsh, blinding fluorescent lights of the mega supermarket illuminated every single stain on the cracked linoleum floor. I sat quietly in the dark, freezing shadows of the expansive parking lot, hidden behind the steering wheel of my beat-up 2005 Ford pickup truck. Leon had expertly tapped into the supermarket's internal security cameras and audio microphones, feeding the live transmission directly to a secure tablet mounted on my dashboard. Through the massive glass storefront and the digital feed, I watched my only daughter plunge her heavily calloused, ungloved hands into a bright yellow bucket of scalding hot water mixed with cheap industrial-grade bleach. The noxious chemical fumes must have burned her nostrils and stung her eyes, a sharp, constant physical reminder of her spectacular self-inflicted fall from grace. She was wearing a stiff, ill-fitting polyester janitorial uniform, a faded navy blue smock with a crooked plastic name tag pinned to her chest. It had been exactly 6 months since the heavy mahogany doors of the downtown conference room had slammed shut, sealing her fate and entirely severing her from my immense protective fortune. Left entirely alone to face the ruthless, violent collection agents representing the underground syndicate, Jada had been forced to surrender absolutely everything she owned. The designer leather handbags, the diamond tennis bracelets, the luxury vehicles, and every single piece of high-end custom-tailored clothing were aggressively seized and liquidated to satisfy the initial crushing interest payments of her husband's debt. She was evicted from her temporary luxury rental and forced to move into a tiny, drafty studio apartment on the dangerous fringes of the city. She was now working grueling 12-hour overnight shifts, scrubbing filthy public toilets and mopping miles of grocery aisles just to make the punishing weekly cash payments to the cartel. The soft, perfectly manicured hands that used to delicately hold crystal champagne flutes at exclusive all-white country clubs were now permanently raw, cracked, and heavily blistered from the unforgiving chemical detergents. Through the screen, I watched her lean heavily against the wooden handle of her industrial mop, her lower back clearly screaming in agonizing pain. Every muscle in her body must have ached with a deep bone-wearying exhaustion she had never known existed. But she did not stop. She dipped the heavy mop back into the steaming, dirty water and wrung it out with a fierce, desperate rhythm. As Jada pushed her heavy cleaning cart down the brightly lit organic produce aisle, the automatic glass doors at the front of the store slid open. A loud, piercing burst of familiar, high-pitched laughter echoed through the quiet supermarket, picking up perfectly on the audio feed. Jada froze her grip, tightening instinctively around the wooden mop handle. Walking down the center aisle, dressed in pristine, expensive winter coats and carrying designer leather handbags that cost more than Jada's current annual salary, was a tight cluster of 3 women. It was the exact same circle of elite high society country club wives she used to drink imported vintage champagne with. The very women who had watched her premium credit cards violently decline at the upscale French restaurant on the exact day her entire fabricated life began to unravel. I watched Jada's initial terrifying instinct take over. She took a half-step backward, clearly wanting to abandon her cleaning cart and sprint toward the swinging doors of the employee break room to hide her absolute crushing humiliation. But before she could even turn around, the lead woman, a remarkably arrogant and notoriously vicious socialite named Victoria, spotted her. Victoria stopped dead in her tracks, her perfectly contoured face contorting into a mask of pure, unfiltered shock which rapidly morphed into a cruel, malicious smirk. "Oh my God, girls, look who it is!" Victoria sneered loudly, intentionally ensuring her piercing voice carried down the entire aisle and directly into the security microphones. "It is Jada Kensington. I heard the terrible rumors about her husband going to a federal penitentiary for fraud, but I had absolutely no idea she ended up scrubbing floors for minimum wage." The other 2 women gasped in exaggerated, highly theatrical horror, aggressively covering their mouths as they openly stared at Jada's stained polyester uniform and her raw, blistered hands. "What an absolute tragic disaster," one of them whispered loudly, her eyes raking over Jada with intense, undeniable classist disgust. "I always knew all that money was completely fake. They were nothing but pathetic social climbing frauds the entire time." Victoria took a slow, deliberate step forward, pulling a half-empty cup of expensive, customized iced coffee from her designer purse. She looked directly into Jada's tired, bloodshot eyes, her expression dripping with sheer, unadulterated malice. "You missed a spot right here, sweetheart," Victoria mocked cruelly. With a flick of her diamond-adorned wrist, she deliberately tipped the plastic cup forward, pouring the sticky dark brown liquid and crushed ice directly onto the freshly cleaned linoleum floor, right at the tips of Jada's worn-out non-slip work shoes. The dark puddle of expensive iced coffee spread rapidly across the pristine white tiles, a blatant, highly calculated act of profound social humiliation, meant to completely break her spirit. Months ago, the old Jada would have completely shattered into a million fragile pieces. She would have dropped the heavy mop, burst into hysterical, dramatic tears, and sprinted away in absolute shame, desperately wishing the grocery store floor would swallow her whole. She would have immediately pulled out her cell phone and called her wealthy father, begging and pleading for a massive financial bailout to escape the stinging public embarrassment of her arrogant peers. But the old Jada was entirely permanently dead. The grueling, agonizing months of brutal physical labor, the constant suffocating threat of violent debt collectors, and the absolute destruction of her racist white-collar husband had violently stripped away her fake, entitled ego. Sitting in my freezing truck, I held my breath, watching the screen intensely, waiting to see if the monster I created would run, or if the woman I raised would finally fight back. Standing there in the harsh fluorescent light, looking at the cruel, sneering faces of the women she used to desperately emulate, Jada finally understood the profound, unforgiving lesson I had forced her to learn. She realized that these women with their platinum credit cards and their inherited wealth were utterly hollow. They possessed absolutely no fundamental strength, no survival instincts, and zero actual character. Jada took a slow, incredibly deep breath, visibly steadying her racing heart. She did not cry. She did not avert her gaze or shrink back in submissive shame. She gripped the heavy wooden handle of her industrial mop with her scarred, calloused hands, planted her feet firmly on the ground, and lifted her chin with absolute, unwavering authority. She stared directly into Victoria's malicious eyes with a fierce, penetrating intensity that made the arrogant socialite physically take a nervous step backward. "I am paying off my own debts with my own two hands," Jada stated, her voice incredibly calm, clear, and completely devoid of any embarrassment or fear. "I am working an honest, brutal job to survive the absolute worst consequences of my own terrible mistakes. My father survived the brutal, unforgiving streets of South Chicago by sweeping floors, hauling heavy concrete, and bleeding on steel, just so that my family could eat. There is absolutely no shame in honest physical labor, but there is a massive, pathetic shame in being a cruel, empty woman who has to mock a janitor just to feel powerful." Jada smoothly pushed her heavy mop forward, wiping the sticky coffee spill away with highly practiced, efficient strokes. "Now, if you will excuse me, ladies, you are standing in my workspace." The three wealthy women stood completely paralyzed in the grocery aisle, utterly stunned by the sheer unyielding force of Jada's sudden, overwhelming dignity. Victoria opened her mouth to snap back with another cruel, classist insult, but the raw, uncompromising strength radiating from Jada entirely silenced her. The socialites awkwardly grabbed their designer bags and quickly scurried away down the adjacent aisle, looking over their shoulders with distinct, highly visible discomfort. Jada did not even bother to watch them retreat. She simply plunged her heavy mop back into the steaming bucket of bleach, her posture completely straight, her shoulders pulled back, and continued working her grueling overnight shift. Outside the massive glass storefront hidden in the dark, freezing shadows of the expansive supermarket parking lot, I let out a long, heavy breath that formed a thick cloud of white vapor in the freezing cab of my truck. I turned off the digital surveillance tablet and set it gently on the passenger seat. I watched my daughter face her ultimate terrifying social humiliation and completely refuse to break. I watched her stand her ground, embrace the grueling reality of her situation, and finally channel the strong, resilient black blood that ran deeply through her veins. I took a slow sip from my thermos of hot black coffee, a small, genuine smile forming on my face. The absolute crucible of poverty and physical exhaustion had finally burned away the entitled parasite. For the very first time in her entire adult life, my daughter finally possessed real, undeniable dignity. The brutal 12-hour overnight shift finally ended at 6 in the morning. The heavy automated glass doors of the mega supermarket slid open, releasing Jada into the freezing, unforgiving Chicago wind. I sat perfectly still inside the freezing cab of my beat-up 2005 Ford pickup truck, watching her navigate the icy, snow-covered parking lot. Her physical exhaustion was completely undeniable. Her shoulders were heavily slumped, her posture broken by miles of pushing industrial mops and hauling heavy buckets of chemical bleach. She wrapped her thin, inadequate winter coat tightly around her stained polyester uniform, shivering violently against the bitter cold. She began the long, agonizing walk toward the public bus stop at the edge of the sprawling lot, entirely prepared to endure an hour-long commute back to her tiny, drafty studio apartment. As she walked under the flickering yellow light of a tall parking lamp, she lifted her head and froze completely in her tracks. She spotted the familiar rusted grille of my old truck idling quietly in the shadows, the very same vehicle she used to maliciously mock in front of her wealthy, arrogant friends. Jada stood perfectly still on the frozen asphalt, her breath pluming in thick white clouds of vapor. This was the absolute first time we had been face to face since the night I dragged her out of my apartment, slammed the heavy wooden door in her face, and abandoned her to the violent underground syndicate. She did not know if I was there to mock her spectacular downfall or if I had simply come to witness the absolute misery of the monster I had intentionally crushed. She did not run away. She did not avert her gaze. Slowly, she adjusted the strap of her cheap canvas bag and walked deliberately across the icy pavement toward my truck. I rolled down the manual window, letting the freezing morning air flood the cab. The sharp, noxious scent of industrial cleaning ammonia and cheap bleach instantly hit my nose, completely masking the expensive designer perfumes she used to wear. She stopped exactly 3 feet away from my driver's side door. The silence stretching between us was incredibly heavy, far colder and more biting than the winter storm currently burying the city. I looked deeply into her bloodshot, exhausted eyes, waiting for the inevitable, pathetic performance. I fully expected her to drop to her knees on the frozen concrete, burst into dramatic, hysterical tears, and beg for a massive financial bailout. I expected her to frantically explain how her raw, blistered hands could not take another day of manual labor. But the theatrical, manipulative socialite was entirely gone. The brutal crucible of extreme poverty and the constant, suffocating terror of her syndicate debt had completely burned away her fabricated entitlement. There were absolutely no tears. There was no hysterical sobbing. She looked at me with the grounded, hardened eyes of a woman who had finally met the real, unforgiving world. "Dad," she said, her voice incredibly quiet and incredibly hoarse from inhaling toxic cleaning fumes all night. "I am not here to ask you for a single dime. I know exactly what I did, and I know I have to pay every single penny of that $300,000 debt myself. The violent men from the collection agency came to my apartment last week. I gave them every piece of designer clothing, every piece of jewelry, and my entire first paycheck. I am on a strict payment plan, and I will scrub these supermarket floors every single night until the balance reaches zero." Jada took a slow, deep breath, her severely cracked, calloused hands gripping the edge of her thin coat. "I am not apologizing because I am cornered," she continued, her tone completely steady and utterly devoid of manipulation. "I am apologizing because I finally realized what I tried to destroy. I looked at my own father, a man who literally broke his spine to build an empire so I would never know hunger, and I treated him like an embarrassing, disposable servant. I let a racist, hollow, deeply insecure white man convince me that my own black heritage and my family's blue-collar blood were something to be ashamed of. I actively helped him try to chemically destroy your mind just so I could maintain a fake, pathetic position in a world that fundamentally hated me. Mom warned me before she died. She told me my arrogance would eventually leave me entirely alone in the dark. I ruined her immaculate legacy, and I shattered your unconditional love. I do not expect you to ever forgive me. I just needed to look you in the eye and tell you that you were absolutely right to cut me off." I sat in the driver's seat, resting my heavy hands on the worn steering wheel, listening to the most honest, authentic words my daughter had spoken in her entire adult life. I did not reach out to offer her a warm, comforting embrace. I did not pull out my platinum checkbook to miraculously wipe away the terrifying mountain of criminal debt currently crushing her existence. Forgiveness without absolute agonizing accountability is nothing but a temporary pause between betrayals. I reached into the deep inner pocket of my heavy winter coat. I did not pull out a stack of $100 bills. I pulled out a single, neatly folded piece of paper. I extended my arm through the open window and handed it to her. Jada took the paper with her raw, blistered fingers and slowly unfolded it under the dim light of the parking lamp. It was not a bank draft. It was a blank standard admissions enrollment application for the local community college located deep in the south side of Chicago. It was the exact same underprivileged neighborhood where her late mother Diane and I had started our lives, with absolutely nothing but a rusted concrete mixer and a mountain of unpaid bills. When I buried your mother, I made a solemn binding promise to her at the edge of her grave. I stated, my voice rumbling with the immense crushing weight of 4 decades of survival. She made me swear to God that I would never let our immense wealth turn our only child into a useless parasitic predator. I failed her miserably by giving you everything you ever demanded on a silver platter. I thought providing absolute financial invulnerability was the highest form of parental love. Instead, I accidentally forged the exact weapon you eagerly used to try and destroy me. I looked down at the community college application resting in her trembling hands. That piece of paper is the absolute only inheritance you will ever receive from me from this exact moment forward. You are going to continue to scrub filthy public toilets. You are going to continue handing over every single spare dollar to the Asset Recovery Agency until your massive mafia debt is completely satisfied. And during the day, you are going to sit in cramped, underfunded classrooms with ordinary, struggling people who are fighting tooth and nail just to survive. You are going to learn the profound, undeniable value of an education you have to pay for with your own physical pain. You will rebuild your character from the absolute dirt exactly the way your ancestors did. Jada stared down at the simple community college enrollment form. She did not complain about the extreme, crushing hardship I was actively condemning her to. She did not ask how she was supposed to physically survive a grueling 12-hour overnight manual labor shift while simultaneously attending daytime college classes and fighting off violent loan sharks. She did not display a single ounce of the aggressive, wealthy entitlement that used to define her entire existence. She simply looked up at me, the harsh fluorescent lights reflecting off the deep, dark bags under her eyes. She nodded her head, once a slow, definitive gesture of absolute acceptance. She carefully folded the application and placed it securely inside her cheap canvas bag. I saw a faint, undeniable glimmer of the strong, resilient black woman Diane always knew she could become. It was a tiny, fragile spark, but it was finally real. Pay off your debt with your own 2 hands. Jada, I said, my voice carrying the absolute, uncompromising finality of a judge delivering a lifelong sentence. Learn what it actually costs to survive in the real world. And when the very last penny of your debt is paid, you can finally start writing your own life. I did not wait for her to respond. I turned my eyes back to the icy road ahead, grabbed the heavy gear shift, and put the old truck into drive. I rolled up the manual window, cutting off the freezing winter wind, and pressed my foot down on the accelerator. The loud rumbling engine of the beat-up Ford echoed through the empty parking lot as I drove away into the dark, snowy Chicago morning. I looked in the rearview mirror one final time. Jada was standing entirely alone under the flickering streetlight, clutching her canvas bag, watching my taillights disappear into the blinding snow. She was completely isolated, entirely bankrupt, and facing years of brutal, agonizing physical and financial struggle. But as I turned the corner and merged onto the main highway, a profound sense of absolute peace finally settled deeply into my chest. I had ruthlessly, completely destroyed the entitled monster, and in doing so, I had finally given my daughter her very first chance to become a human being. The early morning mist rolling off the tranquil surface of Lake Michigan was thick and completely silent. 2 entire years had passed since that freezing, brutal morning when I left my daughter standing alone in the desolate supermarket parking lot. I sat comfortably on the expansive cedar deck of my secluded lakefront property, a modest but beautifully constructed, heavily fortified home I had purchased outright with a fraction of my hidden wealth. I held a steaming mug of strong, bitter black coffee in my hands, feeling the heat radiate into my calloused palms. The esteemed cardiologist at the downtown clinic had recently told me that my terminal heart condition had miraculously stabilized. My blood pressure had plummeted to completely healthy levels. It turns out that permanently excising a toxic parasitic son-in-law and the constant crushing stress of a grossly entitled daughter from my daily existence was the absolute best medical treatment money could buy. I breathed in the crisp, clean autumn air, savoring the profound, undisturbed silence that surrounded my private estate. There were no arrogant corporate executives demanding I pick up their dropped medication from the floor. There were no spoiled socialites screaming about declined credit cards in luxury French restaurants. There was only the gentle rustle of the towering pine trees, the distant call of a loon, and the quiet, undeniable satisfaction of a perfectly executed, meticulously planned retaliation. I had completely reset the board, and I was the only player left standing. My elite attorney Richard still sent me routine, highly detailed monthly dossiers on the spectacular ongoing ruin of Blake Kensington. The former senior vice president of my commercial leasing firm was currently serving his 15-year sentence in a maximum security federal penitentiary in Indiana. According to the prison logs Richard effortlessly acquired through his network, Blake had been assigned the absolute lowest tier of manual labor available in the heavily guarded facility. The man who had proudly worn bespoke Italian wool suits, drank vintage champagne, and bragged to his junior colleagues about swindling an uneducated, outdated black construction worker was now spending his days aggressively scrubbing filthy stainless steel prison toilets and mopping the concrete floors of the maximum security cell blocks for 12 cents an hour. His high-powered corporate network had completely abandoned him the very second the federal indictments were unsealed. He had absolutely no visitors, no commissary funds to buy basic comforts, and zero hope of early parole. He was permanently buried alive under the crushing, suffocating weight of his own monumental arrogance, forced to manually serve the very system he thought he was above. Jada, however, had chosen an entirely different path through the fiery crucible I had constructed for her. She had spent the last 24 months strictly adhering to the grueling, unforgiving payment schedule established by the ruthless commercial collection agency. She scrubbed those expansive supermarket floors every single night without a single word of complaint, breathing in toxic bleach fumes and destroying her manicured hands. During the day, running on a mere 4 hours of sleep, she sat in the crowded, underfunded classrooms of the Southside Community College. She had successfully paid off exactly 1/3 of her massive $300,000 syndicate debt with her own raw, blistered hands. She drove a severely rusted 20-year-old sedan with a sputtering engine that she bought for $800 in cash. It was a stark, jarring contrast to the pristine luxury vehicles she used to demand. Every Sunday afternoon, rain or shine, she drove that beat-up car out to my lakefront property. She never once asked me for a single dime to ease her crushing burden. She never asked to move into the warmth and security of my new home. She simply sat on the porch with me, drank cheap grocery store tea, and talked to me with the profound, genuine respect of a woman speaking to a father she had finally learned to value. Our conversations were no longer about what I could buy for her, but about the brutal reality of the world she was finally discovering. I looked out across the expansive glass-like surface of the calm lake, watching the morning sun slowly burn away the lingering fog. I thought about my late wife Diane and the fierce, uncompromising wisdom she always tried to instill in our family before she passed away. For decades, I had genuinely believed that shielding my daughter from the brutal, racist, unforgiving reality of the world was my ultimate sacred duty as a father. I thought that providing blank checks, unlimited credit cards, and absolute financial invulnerability were the ultimate expressions of paternal love. I wanted her to walk through the world without ever feeling the heavy, suffocating chains of poverty that had bound me in my youth. But true love is never blind, and it is certainly never weak. Blind, unearned generosity does not create strong, resilient adults. It creates lazy, entitled monsters who will eventually devour the very hands that feed them. By stripping Jada of her fake luxury kingdom, by forcing her to face the terrifying, violent consequences of her own extreme greed, I had given her the greatest gift a father could possibly provide. I gave her the absolute, uncompromising gift of accountability. When you pour the concrete foundation for a 50-story commercial skyscraper, you cannot mix the cement with cheap sand and expect the building to withstand a Category 5 hurricane. You have to use heavy reinforced rebar and the highest grade industrial materials, or the entire structure will violently collapse and kill everyone inside. I had built Jada's life on a foundation of unearned privilege, and it almost destroyed both of us. I forced her to dig through the dirt to find her own spine. The grueling, agonizing pain of her poverty, the exhaustion of her manual labor, and the terror of her syndicate debt was the necessary purifying fire required to forge her character. I watched the water ripple gently against the wooden dock. The massive underground real estate empire I had built with 40 years of blood and sweat was still fully intact, perfectly insulated behind multiple layers of anonymous corporate trusts and holding companies. But its fundamental purpose had changed. It was no longer a crutch to support a parasitic, ungrateful lifestyle. It was an impenetrable fortress, and I was the absolute undisputed king inside its walls, waiting for the day my daughter finally proved she was worthy enough to enter the gates. Society loves to lazily categorize people based on superficial, entirely meaningless metrics. They look at a quiet, elderly black man wearing faded flannel clothes, driving a rusted truck, and speaking with a soft, unassuming voice, and they instantly assume he is a powerless relic of the past. They assume he is an uneducated, harmless servant who can be easily manipulated, casually discarded, or confidently spoken down to by arrogant white-collar executives in custom suits. They look at the color of my skin and the calluses on my hands, and they completely fail to recognize the immense, quiet, lethal power of a man who survived a brutal, unforgiving era designed specifically to crush him. They never see the apex predator hiding patiently beneath the unassuming exterior. I stood up from my comfortable cedar chair, taking one last deeply satisfying sip of my strong black coffee. The bitter taste was perfectly balanced against the profound sweetness of absolute total victory. I turned back towards the warm, quiet comfort of my heavily fortified lake house, my mind perfectly clear, and my formidable legacy entirely secure. Let this story serve as a permanent, unyielding warning to anyone who thinks they can easily swindle the quiet, hardworking generation. Never ever mistake a lifetime of silent patience for a moment of weakness. And never treat an old blue-collar black man like he is your disposable servant. Because I do not serve this world. I buy it. Another profound lesson this experience solidified is that true power never needs to announce itself. Those who loudly flaunt their status, flashing premium credit cards and demanding subservience from others, are often the most fragile and heavily leveraged. They build castles on sand, relying entirely on the silent strength of the people they look down upon. Real wealth and genuine authority are quiet. They are forged in the shadows through decades of discipline, resilience, and unyielding hard work. When you truly own the ground you stand on, you never have to raise your voice to prove you are the king. If you believe that respect must be earned and arrogance always meets its downfall, please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share your own experiences in the comments below.